Huge silver slimes, which were incredibly rare monsters, happily settled down in a clearing. They really liked the green grass, and the funny creatures had a wonderful time. But despite their cute appearance, the monsters remained quite dangerous creatures, so people tried to avoid contact with them. A man ran out onto the clearing, and he did it so quickly and impetuously that it was impossible to warn him about the danger posed by the 4 slimes. In the next moment, the stranger cut through not only the air around him, but also the monster. The second and third blows were also critical hits on the silver slimes. Finally, the 4th swing of the sword put an end to this short battle. After that, the young man looked around carefully with his emerald eyes, checking the area to see if another monster was hiding somewhere. A player named Takahashi Yukita received a notification about the status and rewards he had earned as a result of destroying the silver slimes. People were amazed by what they saw, because the stranger had killed the monsters, and each one with a critical hit. As a result, he received rare items. This guy was a real lucky charm, and it was hard to compete with him. Takahashi happily examined his new items, which turned out to be of high rank. Armor, gloves, and boots delighted the young man, and he could hardly believe it was true. Most likely, it was a reward for all the hardships the guy had endured in his past life. Takahashi Yukita was once a bronze-ranked adventurer. He was a frail old man with a gray beard and long hair. He lived in the Tokyo underground on the 1st floor and moved around with the help of a sword, which he used as a walking stick. The player looked miserable. His clothes were old and torn, and he had no shoes at all. One day, one of the dungeon dwellers showed a video clip showing that monsters had already reached their area. They were huge flying lizards that destroyed everything around them. Life outside was in great danger. One of the dungeon dwellers suggested going deeper underground to hide, while another thought it was foolish, as the monsters would catch up with them anyway. The old man went about his business, ignoring the commotion around him, and didn't even pay attention to the warning issued by one of the young players. It seemed that the old man was interested in nothing but the slimes that were on this level of the dungeon. People stopped paying attention to the old man because he was just a burden, and a useless person whose status would never rise again. At one point, he fell to the ground and sat alone and sad while the rest of the people tried to escape from the dungeon. Takahashi Yukita was one of the adventurers who appeared on Earth several decades ago. With the advent of adventurers, a familiar system of characteristics emerged, but with individual types of development. Each player's level increased when they defeated monsters. As the level increased, so did the player's characteristics, so everyone was interested in destroying as many slimes as possible. People dreamed of increasing their strength by even a few points, so that they could destroy monsters faster next time and get additional items. In addition, some adventurers were granted magic or special skills, such as healing, which was in high demand in this cruel world of monsters. It was a world where everyone could rise up, except for Takahashi Yukita. His stats remained extremely low, despite all his efforts and long gaming life. The player had already become a frail old man, gray-haired, toothless, sick, and unhappy, but he still couldn't rise. It cannot be said that he did not try, because from his youth he defeated weak monsters and eventually reached level 98. No one could defeat the player, and in the end, he was the only one who scored so many points. But his whole life consisted only of destroying slimes. Years passed, and he remained a lonely and unwanted person. At some point, his weapon broke. His sword literally fell apart in half as a result of another attack and battle with silver slimes. Takahashi reached level 99 and understood that his efforts would pay off as soon as he reached the top. The old man gathered himself and, with his last ounce of strength, rushed into the attack without any weapons in his hands. He began the battle with his bare hands, realizing that his stats were simply delayed, because it couldn't be any other way. The player had already lost his human appearance, but, tearing open the slime, he found its core and eagerly ripped it out of the creature. An animalistic grin distorted the man's face, and he devoured the monster's core, hoping that the most important event of his life would now take place and all his suffering would be rewarded. Soon, information appeared that the man had indeed reached the maximum level. Takahashi was happy and hoped to receive bonuses to restore his health, gain vitality, and continue his happy life. The notification said that the man's strength had increased by 1 point, and now his efforts would be rewarded. However, another dose of disappointment made the player cry and curse his life. It was all for nothing, and Takahashi got nothing but a confirmation of the highest level. His vitality, endurance, agility, and speed remained the same. Hope finally left the old man, and he could no longer bear this life, which turned out to have been lived in vain. Since childhood, everyone had looked down on the man. One of the main disappointments of his life, Yukita considered, was that he had let his family down. He had been unable to save his loving mother, who had died of illness, or his unfortunate sister. His life had been futile and useless, and now it had come to an end. Death had arrived. Suddenly, an error occurred in the Takahashi Yukita character system. The life restoration and rollback function was activated. Hidden parameters were discovered, and bonus characteristics were added as compensation. With difficulty, he opened his eyes and saw the figure of an unfamiliar woman in front of him. She congratulated Mr. Takahashi Yukita on becoming an adventurer and presented him with a personalized medallion. The young, black-haired, well-built young man with emerald eyes received the medallion, trying to understand what was happening around him. His confusion raised questions, but the young man became embarrassed and said that everything was fine. Takahashi stepped aside to calmly remember what had happened and figure out where he was and at what level. The date on the calendar coincided with the day he registered with the Adventure Guild. Trying to remember the previous events, the young man recalled that before his death, he had seen information about bonus characteristics. He decided to urgently check the characteristics window. All the indicators were, as usual, at a negligible level. However, an additional line caught his attention. Takahashi read it carefully and realized that he had received the luck option, along with 9,999 points. This was incredible, because in his previous life, such an option did not exist at all. Most likely, it was a hidden parameter. Of course, it was surprising, because the young man still remembered himself as a person with 70 years of failure behind him. Takahashi decided not to wait long and immediately test his new ability by hunting slimes. He descended into the Tokyo underground to the first floor of the Imperishable Traces, which was a clear, sunny day in the mountains, with green plains and small trees. The player looked around carefully and immediately noticed the objects he was looking for. It was a group of slimes happily grazing on the grass, looking like very harmless creatures. To Yukita's delight and relief, he saw a silver slime, an incredibly rare monster. In his previous life, the player had only encountered a silver slime once, and then the monster was able to avoid battle because it ran away as soon as it saw the person. Silver slimes granted an unprecedented amount of experience points, and Takahashi prepared to destroy it. Silver slimes were famous for their elusiveness, and when the guy was just a step away from striking, another player, an archer, scared the monster away with his shot. To Takahashi's surprise, the silver slime did not run away, even though it should have disappeared because of the noise. On the contrary, the creature prepared to attack the player, but Takahashi, in turn, also rushed into the attack, raising his sword toward the silver slime. They clashed in attack and the parrying began. This time, the player was fast and strong enough to cut through the silver slime and destroy it with a single move. The sword couldn't withstand the blow and broke, because silver slimes were extremely durable. The player decided to buy a new weapon and opened the characteristics window, when suddenly he noticed a strange glow behind him. It was simply incredible. The young man had received an S-rank item, a huge, powerful sword lying on the grass and glistening in the sun. The great silver slime sword increased attack power by 1/3, and Takahashi couldn't wait to start a new hunt. In one of the glades, he was incredibly lucky. 4 silver slimes were grazing on the grass at once. They also noticed the player and considered it good luck, rushing to attack the young man. There was no other way out. The guy had to fight. Given the characteristics of the sword, it was impossible to hit all the slimes with one blow, but that was not a problem. Critical hits followed one after another, leaving no slimes alive. As a result of this attack, the player obtained armor, boots, and gloves. Takahashi himself could not understand how he managed to defeat them all at once, and went hunting, which lasted about an hour. During this time, he encountered about a dozen silver slimes, and each one gave him a rare item. In the end, he had to admit that luck was not just an empty word. Now that Takahashi Yukita possessed such power, he could definitely become an important person and make up for everything he had missed out on in his past life. The young man hoped to make his family happy and cure his sick mother, whose health had deteriorated significantly. In addition, he dreamed of creating a happy and peaceful life for his sister. Immersed in these fantasies, Takahashi realized that now he had a home to return to. 70 long years of loneliness were behind him. That was the past, and there was no point in clinging to it. He needed to live in the present and look to the future. The guy took advantage of the passage from the Tokyo underground to the streets of the city. He rushed in the direction of his apartment. He hadn't been in this neighborhood for so many years. Seeing his house from afar, Takahashi remembered it. Although doubts remained, fragments of memory told him he was on the right track. With his heart pounding, the guy climbed the stairs, not knowing what awaited him there. He stood in front of his apartment, not understanding why he was so nervous, because a happy reunion awaited him. Calming down and gathering his thoughts, hoping for the best, Takahashi Yukita knocked on the door. He was afraid that his relatives would not recognize him or accept him back. Or maybe they had already become strangers, and a new, lonely life without loved ones and friends awaited the young man. But the door swung open, and a pretty girl appeared on the threshold, who happily greeted her older brother and led him into the apartment. The boy rushed to hug his sister, which surprised her greatly, as such behavior was completely uncharacteristic of him. But the young man held his sister tightly, remembering that he had already lost his family once, and now he did not want to repeat the mistake of his past life. Takahashi Yukita decided that he would not allow circumstances to take his family away from him again, as had happened before, and told his sister everything that had happened to him. Nozomi was surprised and amazed at the same time. In addition, she immediately felt hopeful that her brother would be able to save their mother from her illness. The next day, the player went to the game center and exchanged the rare items he had received. With the money he earned, the young man went to an auction selling unique artifacts. There he purchased the highest quality healing potion. The next destination was the local hospital, where his mother was in one of the wards. The brother and sister found the right ward and waited for permission to visit, imagining a happy future. The children announced that they had come to visit their mother and looked at her with loving eyes. Their mother was very moved. She was happy to see her children so healthy and beautiful. She herself had not left the hospital for a long time and looked very weak. Nozomi brought her mother some treats, delicious cakes that looked pretty and appetizing. The woman was pleasantly surprised by such a treat, but said that it would be better for the children to spend the money on food for themselves. After these words, Yukita announced that there was no need to worry about money anymore. In addition, he said that he had prepared another gift for his mother. It sounded strange, but the young man handed her a bottle of potion and asked his mother to drink the medicine. Nozomi explained that her brother had earned money in the dungeon and bought this remedy for his mother. This was surprising, as Yukita had only recently become an adventurer. But the woman did not resist and immediately drank the entire contents of the bottle. Soon she felt significant changes in her body. Her skin turned pink, her body gained strength and was filled with energy. The woman felt as if a heavy burden had been lifted from her shoulders, and it became easier for her to breathe. This news literally made the children happy, who dreamed that their beloved mother would regain her health. Soon, the symptoms of the disease began to gradually disappear and weaken their destructive effect on the woman's body. The disease stopped developing, and the rehabilitation course went quickly. Soon, the woman was discharged home. And looking out the windows of her apartment, she realized that she had once given up hope of ever returning here. It all seemed like a happy dream in which the family was once again living together under one roof, but it was reality. Nothing was as calming and healing as being at home. So even the simplest household chores had a healing effect. Nozomi was happy that her mother was healthy and had returned to them. However, Yukita's thoughts were preoccupied with something else. The young man understood that this was not enough. The potion was only a temporary measure and could not completely cure the disease. This news greatly upset his younger sister, because she did not want to be left alone again. Yukita said that something more powerful was needed. An elixir, for example. Nozomi had already heard about this substance from a television report. The elixir was an item discovered by the best players in the world of adventurers. It was capable of healing a person on the verge of life and death. It was a unique item that could not be bought for any amount of money and could only be found in dungeons deeper than the 50th floor. A unique item is a special thing that only the person who originally found it can dispose of, and it can only be obtained by defeating a powerful creature. Nozomi understood that if an item cannot be bought, then you have to earn it yourself. The girl did not believe that her older brother would be able to descend below the 50th floor. After all, to do so, one had to be a very strong and experienced player. Of course, the journey would be long, and at any moment one could die without ever reaching such a deep dungeon. But Yukita retained the knowledge from his past life, and remembered that the elixir could also be found on higher floors. The young man had heard of one exception. The boss of the 20th floor, the ancient golem. The elixir was a unique item from his treasure trove. However, the chance of encountering this boss was catastrophically small. Finding a rare item or a rare boss was a matter of chance, almost like catching a drop of water in the air. But Yukita remembered from his previous life that it was from this boss that the elixir could be obtained. Now the guy was counting on his luck and was confident that he could handle this task. His younger sister noticed the suspicious expression on his face, but it didn't matter. The main thing was that her brother could do anything. Yukita understood that this time he would not miss his chance at a happy life and would not end up a lonely old man. To make sure everything went well, the young man decided to prepare thoroughly before going into the dungeon. He knew that there was always a loophole, and first he needed to gather the things he would need for his descent into the dungeon. First of all, the guy took care of his equipment. He activated the Great Sword of Silver Slime, and also put on the Silver Slime's Tear Cloak, which reduced the damage he received by a third. Nozomi was surprised that her brother did not wear heavy armor for the dungeon expedition. Yukita said that he simply didn't have the strength, because the armor was indeed very heavy. The young man checked the stats window and realized that he could only hope for luck. His stats were still low, and he couldn't count on full equipment. But then his younger sister suggested a way to improve his stats before encountering serious monsters. She reminded him that there was a fifth floor. This floor was rarely visited by players because most of them immediately sought to fight strong opponents. It was called Alice's Crown. By killing the local monsters, it was possible to obtain a rare item, a magic fruit. Yukita agreed that it would be more logical to start with this dungeon. And, grabbing the snacks his sister had packed, he set off on his journey. Taking a supply of food and the silver slime sword with him, Yukita began his quest for the elixir for his mother's health. The Alice's Crown dungeon was a gloomy forest where sunlight hardly penetrated. It seemed as if it was always night there. The trees were covered with mushrooms, and a light mist enveloped the area. Yukita arrived on this floor and began to study the surroundings. Almost the entire space of the dungeon was filled with plant-type monsters, so it was easy to lose your way. However, the dungeon was considered low-level and had long been partially cleared by other adventurers. The young man used a map to avoid problems and search for monsters. Soon he reached the lair of the Ents, humanoid trees. The Ents lay in wait, camouflaged as part of the surrounding forest. Their mimicry was almost flawless. The young man picked up a stone and threw it at one of the nearby trees. He knew that the roots of the Ents grew in an unusual direction, and that their leaves had no veins. The stone bounced off the trunk, and the tree, unable to withstand the insolence, twitched, thus giving itself away. Soon the monster realized that it had been exposed and stopped pretending to be a tree. Bright eyes appeared on the trunk, and the upper branches turned into paws with sharp claws. The young man realized that his tactic had worked, and with the help of the stone, he quickly identified his opponent. One critical hit with his sword was enough to destroy the Ent. Yukita realized that with this approach, he would be able to complete the task and earn the required number of points. After the monster's death, the magic fruit immediately appeared in the player's inventory. The young man immediately began to eat it. The fruit was almost ordinary and tasted like something between a pear and an apple. However, the taste was irrelevant. The main thing was that his stats began to gradually increase. Thanks to the magic fruit, even though its effect was insignificant, even Yukita could feel an increase in strength. After that, a fierce hunt for Ents began. The player fought and ate, fought and ate. After a while, the young man checked the stats window and realized that his stats had reached an average combat level. It was time to wrap things up and head back, because at this stage, eating fruit was no longer beneficial. Suddenly, something moved behind the player. The movement was so swift that the young man did not have time to see it. The guy barely managed to stay on his feet when two strangers appeared in front of him. These villains decided to teach the newcomer a lesson in good manners. He couldn't take all the loot for himself, and they were going to take away the points he had earned. These players did not have adventurer IDs around their necks, and Yukita realized that they were bandits who preyed on others. The villains considered Yukita a spoiled boy, dependent on his equipment, and promised not to kill him if he gave them his items. The next moment, one of the scoundrels was already lying dead on the ground. Before that, the enemy had used the bee sting thrust technique, which was a level 25 skill. In other words, the enemy was much stronger than Yukita. The bee sting thrust guaranteed an accurate hit that was impossible to dodge. However, this skill reduced the attack power by a third, and thanks to his clothes soaked in silver slime tears, Yukita was able to reduce the damage he took. In short, he only took a third of the blow, and only incredible luck saved him from a gaping hole in his stomach. The second villain was shocked by this outcome. He couldn't believe that his comrade Yamada had been knocked out with a single blow. Yukita turned to the bandit, suggesting he surrender and promising to spare his life. In response, the bandit demanded not to be underestimated and decided to fight from a distance. The bandit had a magical item in her hands with a fireball at the end. Yukita also decided to use additional equipment. He pulled a wooden stick out of his profile. Flowers adorned the end of this stick. The staff looked rather comical, more suitable for girls celebrating the arrival of spring. The appearance of such equipment amused his opponent, and she asked the guy with a smirk if he knew what he was holding in his hands. It really turned out to be a strange substance of absurdity. It looked so ridiculous and silly. The young man had picked it up from a barren Ent. It turned out to be a rare item that activated random spells, so the chance of creating something useful was extremely small. Only in 30% of cases could this item actually help and create the desired spell. At that moment, Yukito activated the Substance of Absurdity, hoping to defeat his opponent with its help. His opponent possessed the attributes of a mage and created special equipment around herself that possessed great magical power. She planned to use the Fireball spell. It was a mid-level spell, but thanks to her equipment, its power was significantly increased. The mage counted on the fact that even the luck inherent in beginners would not save the young man. She activated the spell and directed the fireball at the player. Yukito stood completely calm, showing no fear and making no attempt to hide. Finally, the boy realized that his magic had awakened when he felt a slight movement in the object. The Substance of Absurdity came to life in his hands, and it became clear that it was ready to fulfill any request of its master. The player raised his hand, in which he held the Substance of Absurdity, and it cast a magic spell on its own. The essence of this spell and its name were unknown, but the fireball launched by the villainess scattered around the guy. In the next moment, something incredible happened. The fireball launched by the opponent suddenly turned around and flew back. It was amazing. The young man had managed to create a high-level spell called Meteor, and the fireball left his enemy no chance. The bandit tried to explain what was happening by saying that it was just a magical illusion, and that the meteor spell was not real. But the approaching heat and the giant pillar of fire were so real that even the villainess realized the reality of the situation and her inevitable defeat. She did not try to run away, but only instinctively covered herself with her hands, staring wide-eyed at the approaching end of her life. When the flames died down, a huge dent remained on the ground, and the surrounding trees and bushes were burned to the ground. The body of the dead evil mage lay in the ashes, but she was not completely dead. Yukito had strained so hard trying to activate the spell with the Substance of Absurdity that he ended up breaking it. But he had no time to mourn this, so he simply threw away the damaged item and moved on. Yukito realized that he was incredibly lucky, which was not the case in his past life, and therefore future battles no longer seemed so frightening and insurmountable to him. 2 bodies of dead bandits remained at the scene of the battle, and the guy decided that they couldn't just be left there. Yukito used his abilities to carry the bodies outside so he could neutralize them. Once they got out of the dungeons into the real world, the dead villains came back to life, and the young man had to tie their hands and feet so they couldn't escape. After that, the young man handed the villains over to the police, because their activities were criminal, and such behavior in the game world was punishable in the real world as well. Yukito had to stay at the police station for a long time, as he gave testimony and recounted in detail what had happened in the dungeon. After the interrogation, he went straight to the game center to receive bonuses and update his information. He apologized to the manager for his long absence, explaining that it was due to difficulties that had arisen. However, upon learning the player's name, the female manager stood up straight and informed him that the city police had already reported everything to the center. This turned out to be excellent news, as Yukito did not have to explain everything again. The manager, armed with a large bell, rang it throughout the neighborhood and loudly expressed her congratulations. Player Yukito Takahashi was promoted to silver level. The guy couldn't believe his ears, thinking there must be some mistake, because in his opinion, he hadn't done anything special. He had just fought some ents, eaten too much fruit, and neutralized 2 bandits. Achieving silver rank is no easy task. Even talented people usually need about 3 years. To obtain the silver rank, you need to obtain rare items and defeat many monsters. In other words, make a significant contribution to the guild's work. However, the manager said that there was no mistake, because the young man had caught 2 members of the Crimson Hands gang. The Crimson Hands is a large criminal group, so powerful and dangerous that the guild rewarded Yukito with a promotion to silver rank for capturing or killing its members. The manager confirmed the young man's guess, saying that he had indeed worked hard and earned enough points. It turned out that these 2 possessed power comparable to that of the adventurers of the Silver Age, and were much stronger than Yukito had thought. The female manager admired the young man's modesty, as he continued to insist that he was just lucky. But this modesty was perfectly suited to an adventurer of his rank. The accessible floors were determined by the adventurer's rank. Bronze ranks could only go down to the 10th floor, silver ranks to the 30th, and gold adventurers had no restrictions at all. Yukito admitted that he would like to reach at least the 20th floor. The manager said she believed in the player, but warned that this place was very difficult to clear. She strongly advised against going there alone, as the 20th floor was a serious challenge even for strong players. Yukito left the game center, thinking that he had advanced through the levels much faster than he had expected. In addition, the encounter with the bandits, oddly enough, had also been a kind of luck for him. As he was thinking about what had happened, the guy heard someone call out to him. The stranger turned out to be an elderly man who looked very impressive, as if he were a representative of the 19th century. He was dressed in trousers and a frock coat, wore a hat on his head, and carried a cane in his hands. His old, thin face expressed deep sadness. Yukito, being kind and responsive, immediately stopped when he heard the call. The old man asked if he was really the adventurer who had defeated 2 criminals, pointing to a stand with posters of the wanted villains. Yukito told the stranger that the villains had attacked him first, and that he had only responded to their aggression, although he had not intended to kill them at all, but was simply carrying out his mission on the floor. After hearing this, the old man gratefully grabbed the young man's hand, looked him in the eyes, and expressed his sincere gratitude and admiration for his actions. With a determination unexpected for his age, the old man tore the photos of the criminals from the bulletin board and said with bitterness in his voice that they had killed his son. Unfortunately, the police had been unable to catch the gangsters for many years. They had been committing their crimes with impunity. But now Yukito had managed to catch them. After that, the man took off his hat and bowed very low in gratitude, saying that he was infinitely grateful to the young man. Finally, the old man could bring good news to his son's grave and then die peacefully, knowing that the robbers would be punished. Yukito looked at his hand, which the old man had shaken just a moment ago, and thought that in his past life he had never experienced anything like this. Someone thanking him so sincerely. It was a very warm feeling. Remembering his past life, Yukito thought, if nothing changes, the world will be destroyed and everything will go on as before by the time he becomes an old man. But, with this information, he could not remain inactive now, as that would doom the world around him to destruction. However, doubts began to arise in his mind. The young man thought that he would not be able to jump higher than his head, and was too weak to fight for peace in the whole world. First, he had to save at least his mother from her illness, and only then could he take on the task of saving the whole world and humanity. Saving his mother's health became his main task, so the young man set off on his next mission. He needed to gain enough strength to fight for the elixir. One of the dungeons was gloomy and dark. The walls were lit by torches hanging along the corridors. On the table lay sharply sharpened knives of various sizes and shapes, as well as lockpicks and screwdrivers. The owner of this wealth was an angry gangster, a huge, short-haired man with black hair and large hoop earrings in his ears. He was screaming with rage at what was happening. The man pounded his fists on the stone and couldn't believe that his friends Hashimoto and Yamada had been defeated and were now in prison. If the same thing happened to the rest of the gang, he would not be able to pay the tax to the bully. Anger and rage raged in the robber's soul, and grabbing one of the knives, he was ready to rush at his offender, the culprit of all this trouble. The newspaper published a photograph of Takahashi Yukito, whose actions had neutralized the members of the Crimson Hands gang. The bandit stabbed the newspaper photo of the young man with a knife and promised that he would definitely kill this scoundrel himself. But soon common sense prevailed, and the robber put the knife back on the table. The man decided to be cautious. Yukito had single-handedly defeated 2 serious gangsters, which meant that the young man was clearly not lacking in strength. The robber decided to use other methods, in which the young man's strength would not matter. He walked over to the coat rack and took down a blanket, wrapping it around his head and almost completely hiding his face. The bandit declared that the stranger's luck had run out at that very moment. Time passed, and Yukito gradually moved closer to his cherished goal. He was now on the 15th floor of the dungeon. Soon he would reach the elixir and save his mother. The 15th floor was a mountainous area with protrusions. It was necessary to climb to the peak of the lonely mountain of death. There were many winding and narrow passages in this dungeon. The terrain was treacherous, and due to its geographical features, it was difficult to clear with a group, so it was easier to move around here alone. In addition, it was easy to hide in this place. The floor had a bad reputation as a hotbed of crime where many people had disappeared. Yukito decided not to drag his feet and realized that this was the perfect arena for a lone hunter like him. So the young man rushed up the cliff using his abilities. When he reached the top, Yukito decided to continue leveling up and finish learning the necessary skills. So he waited for a huge bird of prey to appear. It was an excellent opportunity to train before more difficult levels. So with the help of the silver slime ball, the young man defeated the predator in the form of an eagle. Initially, the young man wanted to level up by killing only silver slimes, but apparently he killed so many of them that they stopped appearing in his path. Therefore, he decided to exterminate as many monsters of other species as possible, and after the slimes, stronger mobs followed. There were also strange creatures, round, one-eyed stones that rained down on the player. He also destroyed powerful and dangerous bears without much trouble. As a result of these actions, Yukito received more and more valuable and unique items in his inventory. Hiding behind a rock ledge and covering his head and face from the gaze of other players, the bandit watched Yukito, trying to plan his revenge. He noticed that the guy was alone and had a great silver slime sword, but he had almost no armor. The villain believed he could defeat such an opponent, but to do so, he needed to observe the guy a little longer. Unsuspecting Yukito continued to destroy monsters, striving to improve his game stats. The bandit decided that the young man had encroached on his territory, but he still did not dare to attack right away. He noticed that Yukito had not left the dungeon for the night, but had set up camp, which suggested that he planned to stay on that floor. The bandit had an evil idea. He decided to take revenge without getting involved himself. Under cover of night, he left for his hideout. This was his territory, and the scoundrel considered himself the boss here. In the world of monsters and animals, there are food chains, and the villain was going to take advantage of this. At the bottom were ants and locusts, then mantises, and at the top of the pyramid was a predatory flying bird. The bandit found the bird's nest with a small chick and waited for the right moment. As soon as the bird was distracted by its young, the villain crept up behind it and stabbed it with a knife, not even sparing the little chick. According to his plan, it was necessary to reduce the number of predators, which is what he set about doing. The next step was to increase the number of prey, so he began to feed predatory insects with bird droppings and carcasses. The satiated monsters began to multiply at a frantic pace, and soon faced a problem of food shortage. They began to attack their opponents. Despite being weaker, their ecological pyramid was collapsing. The irreversible mass reproduction of insects was the next stage. Soon, all the dark corners of the dungeon were littered with the eggs of predatory locusts. After waiting for the right moment, the villain decided it was time to put his plan for revenge into action. He prepared for a terrible attack, counting on the wave of predators to destroy anyone who stood in his way. This plan was a brilliant solution because it did not resemble a typical murder and could not lead the police to the real culprit. The villain planned to make it look like an accident, as if an unlucky adventurer had accidentally stumbled into the monster's lair. This situation was not supposed to attract public attention, so the villain considered his plan to be simply perfect. He used a monster insect repellent to complete his revenge. The bandit poured the repellent on one of the insect egg clutches, causing them to become extremely angry and ready to attack. When the enraged predatory creatures took to the air, not understanding what was happening but clearly sensing that they could no longer remain in their habitat, the villain directed them toward Yukito Takashi so that the predators would devour him whole. The villain dreamed that not even a bone would remain of his opponent, and that the young man's death would be long and painful for what he had done to the bandit's friends. Yukito himself continued to clear the area, destroying all kinds of monsters, earning points, and leveling up. Suddenly, a strange sound reached his ears, a buzzing reminiscent of something familiar. A moment later, the young man realized that the sky above the dungeon was swarming with bloodthirsty locusts, so numerous that they completely obscured the sky. The young man stared intently at the black cloud, trying to understand what was happening. But when he realized the reality of the situation, horror literally paralyzed him. The black cloud turned out to be a swarm of deadly cicadas that devoured everything and everyone in their path. Soon there would be no monsters left in this dungeon except for them. It was impossible to fight such a swarm alone, so the boy ran away, trying to escape, or at least hide. Yukito knew he needed to join someone, and tried to remember where groups of adventurers usually gathered. In his previous life, he had once overheard players talking about a supply base located on this floor. Since this base was built, clearing Lone Mountain Peak had become much easier. According to the guys, the base was located in a red clay cave, but for some reason it was not marked on the map. The young man reached the place where the base could theoretically be located, because the red clay cave was right there. There was no time to lose, and the young man rushed headlong toward the red clay cave. He had to cross the chasm. The player jumped into the ditch and pushed off from the back of a huge toad that was sitting at the bottom of the pit. With his next move, the guy jumped up and got out onto the ground. He began to examine the mountain and noticed that part of its surface differed in color from the main mass of rock. Yukito began to shout, asking anyone for help and warning that there were many monsters nearby. A swarm of huge cicadas was approaching with every passing second, and the guy realized that there was no time to waste. He had to act immediately. He grabbed his sword and began to cut into the rock where the ground was a different color, trying to cut himself an entrance. Soon the ground collapsed, because it had indeed been artificially piled up and could not withstand the repeated blows of the sword. A gruesome scene appeared before Yukito's eyes. People were tied up in the cave, their hands and feet bound, their mouths gagged. It was unclear whether they were alive or dead. This scene literally paralyzed the young man. who instead of a warehouse of equipment and supplies found a warehouse of half-dead bodies. He looked at the people, hoping that this was not some kind of perverted entertainment. The people could not say anything because their mouths were gagged and their hands and feet were tied. The guy pulled his sword out of the silvery slime and with one movement cut through all the bonds that tied the people. The people were happy and immediately understood that the stranger had saved them, because they had already thought that the end had come. Yukito asked them what had happened and why they were in the state he had found them in. The people told him that someone had attacked them, and then they suddenly lost consciousness. The fact that they had not been killed could only mean one thing. They were going to be sold. It was like ordinary slave trade. Yukito realized that he had accidentally stumbled upon the criminal lair of the crawlers. Initially, this area was supposed to be a supply point for adventurers, although perhaps that would happen later. And the young man had simply confused his memories from his past life. He remembered how local law enforcement had once found this place. After completely clearing the area and destroying the bandits, the place was turned into a supply base for adventurers, where they could rest, warm up, and get food and drinks. This time Yukito had arrived too early. This was because in his past life, he had been interested in little else but his personal affairs and hunting slimes. His sense of time had dulled with age. But now was not the time to analyze the past, because the pressing problems were really serious. A huge cloud of poisonous cicadas was approaching. The situation with rescuing and finding people surprised the guy very much. But now it was time to take action. Yukito understood that he needed to pull himself together and take urgent measures. Otherwise, the rescue of the people would be in vain. The young man addressed everyone present, saying that he understood what a terrible situation they were in, but now they were facing a common and enormous danger. At that moment, a cloud of deadly cicadas was flying toward them. These creatures would spare nothing and no one in their path. They were already hungry and could sense potential prey from a great distance, so there was no question of them approaching. They would be here soon. The appearance of deadly cicadas in such huge numbers simply paralyzed people. They were shocked and frightened. There was no time left, and if people wanted to survive, they had to join forces with Yukito. People were skeptical because they understood that it was impossible to hide from such a large number of monsters. In addition, they were practically naked, had no weapons, armor, or protection, and all their actions in the current situation seemed simply pointless. The people reported that all their belongings were with the crawlers, and now they had nothing at their disposal except their own hands and feet. One of the women said she could give them her weapon after checking the storage room and making sure there was nothing dangerous there. During his previous dungeon runs, the young man had accumulated a huge number of all kinds of items, and now he poured them out in front of the people, saying that they could take anything they wanted. The stunned people could not believe their eyes. Unique and rare items lay before them, available to take. It was also surprising how one person could have so many things. Yukito was even willing to transfer ownership of these items to the people. It was truly excellent equipment, rare and unique. People slowly began to approach the items, not believing what was happening. Of course, they were surprised at how one person could have accumulated so much, and they wanted to know who he really was. No one recognized the guy and couldn't say anything specific about him, but it was decided to postpone all inquiries until later. It was urgent to get the equipment. Finally, people rushed to the items, grabbing them, as well as clothes and armor. In addition, they took protection and other important equipment, still wondering if they were really allowed to take it. Yukito didn't ask for anything in return, but he did ask for permission to give a few orders during the upcoming battle with the deadly cicadas. After some thought and casting aside their doubts, the players decided to give him this opportunity, since he had saved their lives after all. Besides, the young man had provided them with armor and weapons, and they owed him everything. The rescued looked at the guy with such admiration and sincere gratitude that he once again experienced feelings he had never felt before, feelings he had not had in his previous life. He was ready to burst into tears in front of people from overwhelming gratitude, but he had to put all emotions aside and take action. Yukito suggested using the narrow entrance to the cave to prepare for the encounter with the deadly cicadas. It was clear to everyone that humans would not be able to fight this huge number of flying monsters at once. The cicadas outnumbered them by hundreds of thousands, but the humans had to try to kill as many creatures as possible, and now everyone had to think about how they would do it. It was necessary to meet the monsters at the entrance to the cave, destroy them, and not interfere with their comrades performing the same task. This way, people could take turns killing the cicadas as they flew in, without getting too tired. The battle began, and people tried with all their might to use all the weapons at their disposal, and gradually exterminate the flying monsters. They used conventional weapons, fire, and magical abilities. The entire arsenal was deployed to its fullest extent. The rock was like a living swarm, locusts covered it, and still many monsters had to wait their turn to eat their prey. The deadly locusts were very hungry because they had not eaten for a long time and were already devouring the bodies of their own slain comrades. The passage was too narrow, and the crush among the locusts was insane. People also noted that the number of creatures was simply enormous, and there was no end to them, even though people continued to kill them. With each passing minute, it became clear that nothing was working, and it was unclear whether the situation would change for the better. Suddenly, Yukito noticed the cave ceiling, from which stones and sand began to fall. The young man ordered everyone to retreat, but not to break formation and to continue fighting off the deadly cicadas. The ceiling continued to crumble and collapse, covering the predators with earth. The people barely had time to jump out of the way before the ground collapsed where they had been standing, and the swarm of deadly cicadas, exerting even greater effort, rushed in pursuit. The monsters were already quite hungry, and their huge jaws left nothing alive in their path. There was simply no hope of rescue. The people scrambled deeper into the cave, realizing that at this rate, the cicadas would soon destroy the mountain. It was clear that the people could soon perish. Looking around, they saw that this was not just a cave, but an unfinished mine, which is why it was so unstable. The people noticed abandoned work tools, shovels, barrels, but that wasn't what caught their attention. There were bundles of explosives and dynamite lying on the ground. Most likely, the crawlers wanted to expand the cave with explosives. Yukito decided that they could use the dynamite. They just had to figure out how best to do it. The young man ordered the people to urgently search the cave for explosives and collect them. There was a chance to use them as weapons. However, how to do this without harming themselves remained a difficult question. The people were already physically exhausted because they had been desperately fighting the deadly cicadas for several hours. Soon, only a third of the cave remained because the monsters had managed to eat away at the rock on both sides. The people had nowhere to retreat, and the number of attacking cicadas was still unrealistically huge. The people were running out of time and energy, their weapons had become practically useless, and the walls would not hold out for long either. Assessing the situation, Yukito realized that the people had no other choice, so he called on everyone to listen to him carefully. The young man ordered that all available explosives be handed over to him. The people did not understand the essence of the plan, but they began to carry it out immediately because they had promised to obey the young man's commands. There wasn't much explosive, so there was little hope that it would be enough to destroy all the cicadas. But the young man reassured the people, saying that this amount of explosives would be enough. He decided to blow up the cave so that it would collapse on the cicadas. These monsters were not very intelligent and primarily targeted what posed the greatest threat to them. Simply put, the cicadas would attack the person who had killed the most of them, and that person would be Takahashi. But it soon became clear that they had to act immediately because there was already a huge hole in the ceiling. The young man ordered all participants in the fight to run away. People were shocked, realizing that the guy would soon die. However, he convinced them that he knew what to do in this situation, and the people rushed out of the cave while they still could. Yukito asked them to trust him, and since there were no other options, they had to comply with his unrealistic request. Soon the guy was left alone, and before him stretched a whole sea of angry, hungry, deadly cicadas, dreaming of sinking their sharp jaws into him. Sometimes you have to take risks to get through a difficult situation, and now was one of those moments. Yukito activated the explosives and pushed himself off the ground, jumping upward. The warning said that the guy had no detonation skills, but this was exactly the case when the young man hoped for luck. Soon the system worked, and the detonation was activated. A huge, powerful explosion rang out in the cave, causing most of the deadly cicadas to be blown to pieces or burned in the fire that followed the detonation. The shockwave threw the young man back, but he activated his jumping skill and, pushing off from the crumbling walls of the cave, managed to get out of the epicenter of the explosion. He then gripped his silver slime sword with both hands and prepared to deliver a slashing blow. The strike was successful, and all but one of the deadly cicadas were killed. The huge, monstrous insect did not even think of saving its life, but continued to stupidly approach its end. Yukito struck again with a power strike, and it was clear that he would quickly deal with the lone cicada. In addition, the bee sting strike hit its target precisely. After cutting down the last monster, the boy jumped out of the abyss, pushing off from the walls. People watched the fight in amazement, not believing their eyes and admiring the young man's feat. At one point, it seemed that the boy would fall, but the silver slime sword came in handy, and Yukito stuck it into the mountain to hold on. However, the rocky surface was too solid, and the sword slipped. At the last moment, it became clear that there was nothing to grab onto. It seemed that the end had come. And just as the boy was falling, realizing that nothing could save him, it turned out that the people had managed to get their bearings and threw him a rope loop. Takahashi grabbed it, clutching the rope tightly in his fist, and all he had to do was wait for the people to pull him out of the abyss. When the initial excitement subsided, and everyone was able to comprehend what was happening, the guy sat at the top of the cliff and looked at the huge mass of dead bodies, realizing that he had won. People looked at their savior with admiration and love. Yukita had become a real hero to them and made them believe in miracles. It was also nice to know that after such a serious battle with a huge number of monsters, there were no casualties among the people. The system reported that a large number of monsters had been destroyed, and the young man received new bonuses and reached higher levels. In the secret location where the bandits from the Crimson Hands gang were based, a real massacre was taking place. The villain who had orchestrated the attack of the deadly cicadas was furious because the young man had not only destroyed all the monsters, Yukita had also destroyed the bandits' base, and now the gang would punish the villain with earrings in his ears for this. Everything that was happening was his fault, and the villain drowned his anger in copious amounts of alcohol, beginning to plan his next revenge. In the end, he swore that he would personally kill Yukita, even if it cost him his life. After emerging from the basement in the gaming center, the young man felt that the atmosphere around him had changed. He had become a real hero. People approached him on the streets, and recognizing him, thanked him for his bravery and for saving others, and also wanted to meet him and take pictures with him. It even got to the point where Yukita was nicknamed the Mountain Crusher. Various groups invited him to join their guilds, but the young man was not interested in any of that. His only goal was to earn the elixir, so he didn't want to join any groups or teams, fearing that it would delay the creation of the elixir. The thing was, the items earned in teams were distributed randomly, so the guy could wait a long time for a specific item, because the probability of getting it was lower. The more people there were in the team, the lower the probability of winning, and the more time it would take to collect the ingredients needed for the potion. Yukita remembered that in his previous life, he always cleared dungeons alone, so now he wasn't going to change anything in that regard either. When he returned home after the expedition, a delicious dinner prepared by his mother and sister was waiting for him. The table was laden with Takahashi's favorite dishes. The family gathered around the table to enjoy a delicious meal and celebrate their favorite son's latest achievement. Although the family lived very modestly, they always celebrated holidays. Nozomi admired her brother and was very happy that he had already reached level 20. Mom was very worried because she had heard that after this level, the dungeons become exponentially more difficult. His sister was also worried about Yukita because she had read that only 15% of players were able to pass the 20th level. Takahashi tried to reassure his beloved women, saying that they should believe in him because he was capable of many things. His mother was very proud of her son's actions, which had saved so many people, and hung a newspaper article about Takahashi in his room. However, she asked him not to forget about himself because no parent wants their child to sacrifice themselves for others. The young man wanted to say that no child would want to bury their mother either. He had already experienced this horror once and now did not want it to happen again, trying to avoid this situation in his current life. Nozomi understood that her brother was too stubborn and that it was impossible to change his mind. The boy asked her once again not to worry about him because he was doing this of his own free will. In his past life, he had failed to save his mother, and every time he remembered this, his heart bled. In order to erase the bad memories of the past and start life anew, he simply needed an elixir that could cure his mother. The next dungeon Takahashi went to was the 20th level Tokyo dungeon called The Great Wall That Defies the Laws of Physics. This dungeon consisted of concrete corridors where monsters with stone bodies could be found. Yukita dealt with them quite easily, even though they were huge and strong. The monsters on this floor were made of inorganic substances, but the Silver Slime's sword was very effective against these stone beasts. These monsters were dangerous and cold-blooded killers, lifeless creatures devoid of any empathy, simply soulless instruments of murder. But the boy had no intention of engaging in any dialogue with them. He soon realized that all the monsters acted according to the same pattern, and thus the young man quickly advanced deeper into the dungeon. However, the time came to encounter one of the largest monsters in this dungeon, a creature resembling a pyramid made of huge stone blocks. Its hands were like a real stone press, and one blow from this fist split the floor and walls of the dungeon. However, this primitive monster acted according to a single pattern, and Takahashi soon memorized it, after which he was able to easily avoid attacks and counterattack in response. Acting in this way, the young man soon reached the last hall of the dungeon, destroying all the monsters along the way and gaining levels and points. Standing in front of the huge door, the guy realized that the time had come. From today, he would start a new life. The last hall of the dungeon was gigantic. All kinds of pentagrams and inscriptions in ancient languages were drawn on its floor. The door to the dungeon slammed shut behind the guy, and a huge monster boss appeared in the middle of the hall, taking up almost the entire room. It was an ancient golem, a level 20 boss. Its appearance could scare any player. Its attack was incredibly powerful, so it was necessary to avoid getting hit by its fists. But that was the extent of the ancient golem's difficulty. Its movement speed was quite ordinary. Therefore, an experienced player could handle even such a monster. The young man decided to chip off a piece of armor. During the attack, he noticed a core inside the golem. It was the monster's weak spot, and by destroying it, he could defeat it. It was an excellent plan, except that a bandit from the Crimson Hands gang happened to be there. He had also made his way into this dungeon and was quietly following the young man, waiting for the right moment to kill him and leave him here forever. The battle was in full swing when the hall was suddenly illuminated by a red light, welcoming the monster boss. This monster had a sphere in the center with a core of a different color, lilac pink. It was unreal, but it turned out that there was someone else in this dungeon besides Takahashi. The problem was that the guy didn't sense anyone else's presence, but in general, it was to be expected that there would be uninvited guests. However, it was clear that this player was high level. A beginner would never have gotten involved in such a battle, and now both players were at level 20. These thoughts were suddenly interrupted when someone's knife, thrown from nowhere, had to be deflected with the silver slime sword. The bandit was extremely dissatisfied, realizing that the young man had excellent reflexes and that his latest trick had failed. The villain, however, was not discouraged, realizing that he still had the upper hand. After all, he was not fighting monsters and could see his potential victim, Takahashi Yukito. The day before, the bandit had gathered information about the dungeon the young man was heading to. It was immediately clear that this monster boss could not be defeated alone. The player's website said that a group of at least 4 people was recommended. The villain made his way to the last stage of the dungeon in order to automatically summon a second golem. But unlike Yukita, the bandit didn't have to worry about fighting monsters because they simply didn't notice him. The villain was a thief, and his level was high enough that, with his stealth skills, he was completely safe using cat's footsteps. The bandit decided to tease the enemy to provoke him into attacking the guy. After that, he used his shadow double ability, continuing to move through the dungeon, and threw an invisible cloak over one of the monsters. At some point, the young man could no longer see his opponent, and this could seriously complicate his situation. The villain used the invisibility cloak to hide his presence from his enemies. It turned out that none of the monsters could detect the bandit. It got to the point where the ratio of forces in the dungeon was 3 to 1, but even that seemed insufficient to the villain. The day before, he had coated the blade of the knife with poison, hoping to poison his rival. Choosing the right moment, the villain threw the knife at the young man. He had no intention of engaging in open combat, but simply wanted to corner Takahashi. But the young man's reaction was simply fantastic. He managed to avoid being poisoned. The villain decided that the young man had hidden an antidote under his clothes. But that didn't matter, because the bandit just wanted to keep the young man on edge and prevent him from actively fighting the monsters. Soon, the villain threw several magic traps at the young man, trying to prevent him from moving. He was sure that he would succeed by acting in this way. Instead of relying on some idiots, he decided to tackle the task himself. He stretched barbed wire between the columns in the dungeon hall. His favorite traps never failed him. Thanks to the villain's efforts and his sophisticated imagination, Yukita's movements and maneuvers were severely restricted. The villain was already enjoying the spectacle to come, because it was only a matter of time before the golems killed the guy. All he had to do was watch the show without getting his hands dirty. Takahashi was really having a hard time, because in addition to the 2 monsters, he also had to avoid all kinds of obstacles. After repelling another attack, he turned to the villain. Yukita asked if he had run out of magic tricks and how long the bandit was going to hide. To be honest, the villain was simply speechless. He couldn't understand how this guy had managed to find him and was now demanding that he come down to the hall to fight. Yukita, talking nonsense, quietly made his way to a knife lying nearby and threw it at the bandit at tremendous speed. The villain managed to dodge his own knife, but demanded an explanation of how this kid could see him. Yukita called it hunting instincts, claiming that it was a fairly common skill. The villain couldn't believe it, because hunting instinct is one of the lowest level skills, and it was impossible to detect a high-ranking thief with it. Yukita agreed that this was a lie, but noted that it no longer mattered, because now he was challenging the villain to a fight. The bandit realized that he would not be able to sit it out and decided to end the fight quickly. In any case, he was going to kill the insolent man. And so, the fight between the rivals began. Neither of them gave way to the other, and the blows rained down almost without stopping. However, at some point, Yukita was able to throw the bandit aside. He felt strong and confident in his actions, continuing to taunt and provoke his opponent. Soon, the villain was thrown back again, and in the end, his nerves gave way. He demanded to know how the guy had managed to find him. In fact, Yukita was not lying. Often people do not believe the truth, but readily accept lies. Takahashi activated the warrior's intuition skill, which helped him detect danger around him, although the chance of it working was extremely low. However, it should not be forgotten that luck was always on Yukito's side. Soon he received information about the number of enemies, their location and composition. The villain noted that the guy was quite fast for a hunter of his level and rushed into the attack. A fight broke out between the rivals again. No one could deliver a decisive blow because Yukito was only a hunter by rank. He would never be able to match the thief's agility, and his opponent took advantage of this. In addition, the villain possessed exceptional accuracy because, being a high-level thief, he had become skilled in his movements during thefts. The blows rained down without stopping, and the villain noted that the young man was indeed very well trained. At one point, Takahashi took advantage of a jump, leaped onto the head of one of the golems, and found himself behind his opponent. From above, the young man rushed into the attack, intending to deliver a powerful blow. He wanted to use the bee sting technique to win the battle. However, the villain managed to move and, laughing, called the young man a novice and a simpleton. After that, the bandit activated the butterfly dance skill and began to glide through the air, moving with ease. All of Takahashi's attacks missed their target, and the young man realized that he had missed several times in a row. In this situation, a guaranteed hit was met with a perfect dodge. It was a perfect combination, but the one with the higher level won. To confirm these words, in the next moment, Yukita felt a sharp pain in his thigh. A bleeding wound appeared. The bandit was almost happy, realizing that such a slow hunter would never be able to catch him. At that moment, one of the golems sprang into action and struck, but Yukita managed to crouch down and avoid being hit. The battle between the rivals continued with renewed vigor, but neither of them had a significant advantage. The villain easily dodged the monster's attacks, as they were too predictable, and during the fight he tried to find out who Yukita had bought the information about the golems from. It turned out that the guild sold players information about the composition of monsters in certain dungeons for money. After another series of attacks, Takahashi fell into a trap and stabbed himself in the foot. The villain gloated, assuring him that petty tricks would not help in their battle and that victory would still be his. He believed that his victory was a foregone conclusion from the very beginning of the fight. Activating the scorpion's sting, the bandit rushed into the attack. Yukita had to exert maximum effort to at least partially avoid death, but he was unable to completely parry the blow. He was thrown across the hall to the far wall of the dungeon. The silver lime sword fell from his hands when the young man lost consciousness after hitting his head on a rock. The villain was sure that the outcome was a foregone conclusion and launched a final attack to finish him off. Yukita had nothing to defend himself with, so he closed his eyes, waiting for death. After all, he was cornered, and two swords were already rushing towards him. But, oh my god, what was that? The guy really was a child. He stuck out his tongue, teased his opponent, and said he was just joking. Just as the villain was about to stab him with his sword, the young man activated a gravity trap. Thus, the bandit found himself trapped in a sphere hanging in the air, completely defenseless against any attacks, unable to do anything. Inside the gravity trap, the air had a low oxygen level, so the villain couldn't even speak normally. Yukita said that he had obtained all the information about this floor himself, without buying any data from the guild. The young man was struck by the very fact that there was an idiot who decided to get involved in a battle with someone else's boss. After that, the guy finally took on the bosses and performed an unusual double writ, angering two opponents at once. He continued to taunt the villain, saying that he was a thief, but did not even notice the trap he had fallen into. In the end, it turned out that the villain, who was caught in a gravity trap, became the target of two monster bosses at once. One of them simply smashed him in the head, pinning him to the floor. After the gravity trap was destroyed, the golem grabbed the bandit with its huge paws. Then it threw him to the floor with all its might. The bandit's body, with many broken bones, remained lying in the middle of the hall. However, even as he lay dying, he continued to marvel at how Yukita had been able to detect his traps. The boy explained everything with his excellent intuition, claiming that it was precisely that which had done the trick. After that, Takahashi advised the villain to lie down and not go anywhere. And if he lived to see the moment when the dungeon boss was finished, the young man would hand him over to the police, where the villain would definitely be cured. Leaving the dying body lying in a pool of blood, the young man headed towards the golem to finally finish clearing the dungeon and get everything he needed to make the potion. The villain, however, had no intention of giving up. One could only admire his strength of life, anger, and hatred. Summoning his last ounce of strength, the bandit activated the hidden dynamite and strapped his entire arsenal to his body, declaring that he would not die alone. Everyone would perish with him, and the dungeon would be blown to smithereens. Takahashi, of course, did not expect such a turn of events, and he had no countermeasures against such an act. The young man realized that he was about to die. The mad villain used his last ounce of strength to activate the dynamite, hoping to take his hated enemy with him to the afterlife. A powerful explosion rocked the dungeon. Everything around was engulfed in flames and blown to pieces. A huge hole remained where the bandit had been lying, and the entire dungeon was reduced to a pile of rubble. As a result, the young man flew into the darkness, and it was clear that his body was being carried away to the other world. At least he had tried to change something in his life. However, the landing was not soft at all. The guy slammed into the stone floor with all his might. The impact brought the young man to his senses. Everything hurt, but he had to endure it. If it hurt, it meant he was still alive. Looking up, Yukita realized that the explosion had broken through the dungeon below, and he had fallen through, while the monsters on the upper level remained safe and sound. The guy felt awful, so bad that he knew he wouldn't be able to get up. He tried to look around to figure out where he was and which direction to go. At that moment, both golems jumped down and landed next to the boy. Yukita realized he was surrounded, and once again thoughts of imminent death flashed through his mind. Sitting on the floor with broken legs, the young man noticed a glowing object near the far wall of the room. It turned out to be a chest that emitted a magical light. What was inside was unknown, and the young man did not know if it would help him in his fight against the golems. However, Takahashi realized that he had found himself in a secret room with treasures. The room was too small to maneuver in, and one of the golems almost completely blocked the way to the treasure with his body. The young man realized that he would not be able to win in a fair fight against two bosses at the same time, so he decided to put his hope in the contents of the chest, which might save his life. With these thoughts in mind, he rushed between the golem's legs and managed to slip through a narrow gap. Then, activating his jump, he leaped over the boss, intending to land near the treasure chest. The monsters were not interested in the chest at all and did not claim it. Instead, the golems wanted to destroy the player at all costs, and attacked him before he even managed to land. The young man did not have time to regroup to avoid the blow, and was thrown against the wall by the golem's fist. He suffered new injuries, but he felt that his spine was intact, which meant he had to move and fight. But the golems already sensed victory approaching, and another powerful blow rained down on the player. A terrible pain pierced Yukita's body, and he let out a wild scream, putting all his hatred and despair into it. The lower part of his body was a mess. Both legs were broken in several places, and the pool of blood was growing larger by the second. He could have stayed down because he couldn't get up anymore, but he still had his hands, and his goal, and his dream. The pain was so intense that he felt nauseous. He couldn't stand up, but he wasn't going to give up, so he began to crawl slowly on his elbows toward the chest. The golems, intent on destroying the intruder, attacked again. A new blow pierced the young man's body with wild pain. But this pain was nothing compared to the despair he had felt in his past life, when he lived alone and aimlessly. Now, such an outcome did not suit him at all. Gritting his teeth, the young man managed to crawl a little closer to the coveted chest. No amount of suffering or physical pain could break this young man, who, overcoming everything, dragged his broken body forward. And then, his hand finally touched the coveted chest. Inside the treasure was a bracelet that glowed with a magical light. It was supposed to make the player's life easier. The guy took the bracelet, saying he was taking it for himself. He put it on his wrist, realizing that he simply did not have time to die now. It was a bracelet of changeability, an extremely rare item capable of transporting its owner to any location. The young man logged into his profile and activated the bracelet of change. The golem was already approaching, ready to break the player's bones again, and perhaps even kill him, when suddenly the young man received a warning that the magical item was not suitable for his class. The probability of successfully activating the bracelet of variability was too small and almost negligible. But we remember that this young man always had incredible luck. The protagonist desperately hoped to activate the bracelet, realizing that he could only count on luck, but hoping that it would not let him down this time. At that moment, one of the golems smashed the chest containing the treasure in a rage and was determined to kill the young man. Finally, the system confirmed the use of the bracelet, and Yokito programmed the point to which he was going to move, simultaneously swinging the silver slime sword and planning to strike. The boy understood that in this situation, he could not give up and simply had to win, because not only his life was at stake, but also the life and health of his mother. In response, the second golem, seeing that the young man was not giving up, attacked him with his ranged sword. It was very difficult for the young man, and although he managed to damage one of the golems, he no longer had the strength or health to fight the second one. But he had no choice, and Takahashi activated his next move with the bracelet. He still hoped to complete this mission in his favor. The bracelet of change worked perfectly, and the young man landed on the body of one of the golems. Under the hero's feet was the monster's core, which was its weak spot, and gave him hope of destroying this huge creature. But, distracted by one enemy, the young man did not notice how the second golem approached him from behind and swung its huge hand. The bracelet of changeability saved the young man again, allowing him to move to another place and avoid the blow. In the next attack, Yukita again approached the core of one of the golems, intending to strike as many times as necessary to defeat the monster. The young man thrust his sword between the stone bars that hid the creature's only weak spot. He plunged his silver slime sword into the monster, intending to do so as many times as necessary to kill it. The new activation of the teleportation bracelet allowed him to take an advantageous position. The golem's eyes continued to scan the young man, who was constantly moving thanks to his speed and the teleportation bracelet. However, the monsters did not take their eyes off the young man. At one point, the guy just hung in the air between his opponents. He understood that it was almost impossible to win in this situation, but maybe this was a case where he needed to believe in a miracle and just do what he could. Yukita decided that instead of waiting for outside help that couldn't come from anywhere, it would be better to monotonously and repetitively do what he knew how to do, and eventually achieve his goal. Both golems watched their opponent, ready to pounce on him at any moment and simply crush him to dust, because the young man was barely alive and could only move thanks to the power of the bracelet. Using his approach to life, never give up and do what you can, the young man activated his movement once again. This turned out to be very timely, because one of the golems lost his nerve and struck with his huge fist right where the boy had teleported from. Takahashi activated Bee Sting and rushed into attack at full speed to deliver a critical blow to these stones. This was followed by a storm of blows and another teleportation, but it couldn't be said that this helped to turn the tide of the battle. The guy was just surviving and slowly advancing towards victory. Another series of incredible blows was delivered by the young man, and the stone villains shattered into small pieces. The young man's strength was leaving him, and at some point he could no longer even hold his sword and simply fell flat on his face, while the movement bracelet gave a warning that the usage limit had been reached. Yukita fell from a great height onto his back, onto the stone floor of the dungeon, which was littered with fine stone chips formed as a result of the destruction of the golems. The young man lay completely exhausted, his legs broken, wounded, and bleeding, and at that moment, a notification informed him that Yukita had defeated 2 ancient golem bosses and would receive a legendary item for his efforts. But for 2 bosses, 2 items were given out, which the young man could not even dream of. Bottles with the coveted elixir became his property. This was very timely, and the guy immediately used one of the elixirs. Otherwise, he would not have had the strength to get out of the dungeon. In addition, he could check the quality of this elixir. After drinking the contents of the bottle, the young man felt life energy fill him and surround him with its powerful light, healing his wounds and giving him the energy he needed to function normally. After a while, Yukita woke up and realized that his bones had healed and his wounds had closed. In addition, he felt completely rested and capable of any action. It turned out that everything had been worth it, and now he had in his hands the most desirable thing there could be: the medicine to save his mother's life. There was no point in lying there any longer. He had to return to life and make others happy. So the guy checked his stats and began to climb out of the dungeon. He wanted to take the criminal he had wounded to the police, but the villain had disappeared. All that remained where he had been lying was a cloak with invisibility powers, stained with the gangster's blood. The young man considered this item necessary and useful, and took the cloak with him. After leaving the dungeon, he immediately went to the guild and told the managers everything that had happened to him, as well as about the villain who had sneaked into the dungeon and his subsequent escape. When she saw the blood-stained cloak, the employee was very frightened and rushed to call her boss to resolve the situation. After listening to the young man's story, the guild's chief manager said that the incident needed to be covered in the media. He then asked Yukita to stay and give an interview. The young man had urgent plans, because his mother's health was his top priority, and no amount of fame could change that. Yukito announced that he was in a hurry, apologized, and suggested conducting the interview another day. After that, the young man went home. On the streets, strangers recognized the young man they had just seen on television in a report about a young man who had defeated 2 bosses single-handedly and cleared the 20th floor dungeon in record time. But nothing was dearer to the guy at that moment than his own home, because after the dungeon, he already assumed that he might never return there. The happy faces of his mother and sister were the best reward for completing the dungeon. Takahashi gave his mother the elixir, and she drank it immediately. After that, the whole family went to the clinic to check on his mother's health. The attending physician, who had been treating the woman for a long time, said that the new test results showed a complete recovery. The children were absolutely delighted to hear this news from the doctor, and tears of happiness and relief filled their eyes. The doctor confirmed that the effect of the elixir was simply incredible, and the result obtained from its use was truly excellent. The woman looked at her son, still not realizing that she no longer had to worry about her health, and understanding that all this had been achieved and obtained thanks to the efforts of her beloved son. But Yukita, in turn, thanked his mother for raising him and believing in him. And finally, the young man was able to tell her this and do what he had failed to do in his past life. Because as a frail old man, he constantly remembered his deceased mother, whom he had been unable to help recover. This mutual gratitude and joy deeply moved everyone present. Even Nozomi's sister, despite her cheerful disposition, could not hold back her tears. The girl continued to tease her brother, saying that it would be better if he waited until they got home, and then told their mother about his love, rather than attracting attention in the hospital. Yukita agreed with her, and so they continued to talk, still in the doctor's office, when someone's shadow, watching the family, appeared in the window. The unfamiliar knight, a handsome young blonde who had been eavesdropping on the family's conversation, was indignant that he did not like condemning such sincere and pure-hearted people to suffering. Even the fact that it would happen within the walls of a hospital was no consolation. Of course, they had done everything they could, but sometimes that wasn't enough. The family would not investigate the situation, because the cause of death would be a common heart attack, the stranger thought. Looking at Takahashi's sister, the stranger raised his fist above the girl's head, and it was clear that she could not see or feel anyone's presence, because Nozomi did not even turn around. But just as the stranger was about to strike with his fist, his hand was caught in the sword of the silver slime, which Yukita had put up to protect his sister. Unable to contain his rage and anger, the boy hurled insults at the stranger, demanding to know what he was doing and who he was. The unknown knight was genuinely surprised, but he was in no hurry to comply with the boy's demands because he was more interested in how the young man had been able to see him. Then the protagonist noticed that the stranger's face seemed painfully familiar, and soon he recognized the knight. Standing before him was the strongest of the adventurers, named Hiro. He ranked first in the adventurer ratings. This player was the savior of all humanity because he was the most skilled and capable of fighting and defeating monsters. The player confirmed that the guy's eyes were not deceiving him, and that it was indeed him in person, Hiro, whose real name was Uyama Kosumuraita. And indeed, he was a hero, and #1 in the adventurer rankings. Yukita was genuinely outraged and did not understand why such a renowned player would do something like this, namely, attempt to kill a young girl who had not harmed anyone. The hero did not want to answer these questions because he also had questions for the guy, since they were now moving into oblivion, and ordinary people could not see or feel them. Only those who have tasted death can move into nothingness. That is, those people who have been given a second chance at life. Given this information, the hero realized that there was only one option. It turned out that Takahashi had been reborn. The young man, in turn, also realized that the hero was not living his first life. The player did not deny it and confirmed this version, saying that, for the sake of truth, he was ready to clarify and explain something to the young man. The hero said that he had come to the hospital to eliminate the risk of the end of the world. It was, of course, very strange to hear this version. Yukito did not understand how his younger sister was connected to the end of the world. It turned out that she was one of the factors and could have a negative influence on her future husband, so it was necessary to get rid of Nozomi in advance. His younger sister's future husband was supposed to become a very important person in the world. The future of all human civilization depended on his actions. The hero said that his younger sister's divorce from her husband had greatly undermined the man, and he had gone to extremes, drowning his grief in alcohol and other substances. In the end, this became the root cause of the world's downfall. That is why the protagonist had come today to eliminate his sister. And of course, Takahashi had to be understanding of the situation. The young man was incredibly angry. He believed that the current timeline had nothing to do with the past, and therefore such an act would not change anything. Yukita explained that in the current timeline, he was able to cure his mother, and behaved completely differently than in his past life. He did not abandon his family, Therefore, his sister would not go to work in a nightclub to pay for hospital bills. This means that she will not meet her future husband at this club and accordingly will not cause their divorce and the end of humanity. Takahashi believed that killing his sister made no sense. The hero did not think so at all and called this theory very interesting, but he was not going to believe in theories. Instead, he preferred to take action and drew his sword from its sheath. Yukito also prepared his weapon, saying that he would not allow the hero to lay a finger on his sister. The hero didn't care about any of this, and he really didn't want to kill this young player, or anyone else for that matter, because his desire was to help people, and one sacrifice in the name of peace was a worthy trade. However, these words did not convince the young man at all, and he was not going to back down from his words and agree with the hero's logic. But then a brilliant idea popped into the head of the game's main adventurer. He suggested that the guy prove his potential and fight him. Takahashi did not understand why he should do such a thing, but the hero was apparently bored and said he wanted to take a chance. The media was all about this special player. Yukita understood that the hero looked down on him, and it was completely understandable, because the young man had only just appeared in the game and was quite weak, but the hero's rating had reached its maximum in all categories, and no one could argue with that, because there was no one higher than the hero. The hero boasted to the young man about his performance, and all the maximum scores, of course, spoke for themselves. The hero claimed that the truth was absolutely simple and understandable. Without strength, the young man was incapable of protecting anything, whether it was protecting the world or protecting his own sister. Every reborn person who got another chance at life felt this truth. But without normal achievements and high scores, they couldn't live normally. And now the hero offered the young man a choice. Either he would kill Nozomi's sister right now, or the young man would accept his challenge and fight the hero. The choice was such that, one might say, there was no choice at all. Of course, Takahashi could use the bracelet of changeability and escape. He could even run away, taking his mother and sister with him. But the hero would find them anywhere in the world. He could have spent days on end with his sister, protecting her from possible danger. However, this was physically impossible. Therefore, Takahashi chose the only solution available. He accepted the hero's challenge and agreed to fight him. The hero replied that he already understood the young man's character a little and had no doubts about his choice. He then warned the young man not to worry because the hero would not beat him up. Unfortunately, the non-existence in which they now found themselves could only be used for a limited time. 10 minutes to be precise. Therefore, the young man only had to hold out for that amount of time. If he endured, he would be declared the winner. The hero did not want to hold the duel in the hospital, even despite the building's external ugliness, and suggested finding a more suitable place for the duel. With that, the hero jumped out the window without even looking, back first, and flew down. Takahashi looked at his beloved sister once more, and, determined to protect her, followed the hero. The courtyard between the hospital buildings was ideal for a duel. It was empty, and there were no people nearby who could become accidental victims. Yukita announced that he hoped the hero would not be lenient, and that the battle would be fair and respectful. This made the hero laugh because, as the strongest player on the planet, he didn't even need to try hard to win a duel against such a weak opponent. The hero immediately decided to show off and summoned all his available powers and abilities, which lit up around their owner in multicolored pentagrams. As soon as he did so, a fiery attack was launched at the young man, who barely had time to raise his sword. Yukita noted that his opponent immediately rushed into battle without even giving him time to prepare. The boy managed to parry all the blows, swinging the silver slime's sword at tremendous speed and deflecting everything that flew at him. The hero, continuing to watch his opponent skeptically and confident of his victory, used his ability to multiply, and his doubles were sent to attack the young man. The hero himself took up his sword, commenting that Yukita is often surrounded by enemies, so nothing unusual happens in his life. After these words, the hero himself, as well as his doubles with swords in their hands, rushed to attack the protagonist. Yukita also knew how to make doubles. Of course, they were not as strong or identical, but he could activate a replacement doll, and two funny little men appeared near the guy. Finally, the rivals clashed swords one-on-one and, after minor contact, went their separate ways. At that moment, the hero's double destroyed the young man's replacement dolls, and that auxiliary option was gone. Too easily and simply. Everyone understood that it was impossible to defeat an opponent like the hero by simply defending themselves. Takahashi understood this too. He used his magic wand, which, however, did not always create the desired effect, and there was a high probability of failure. But the guy had no choice. The young man stretched out his arm with the Staff of Absurdity, saying that he just needed to find the time. After that, the magic was performed. It cannot be said that it was a failed attempt. A huge, fiery, powerful explosion was directed at the hero, who stood in surprise and watched as the fireball approached him. Of course, it couldn't kill the hero, but at least it delayed him for a short time, which was exactly what the young man, who was also affected by the explosion, had hoped for. His clothes were slightly singed and smoldering. When the fire burned out and the smoke cleared, the hero walked towards Yukita, completely unharmed. Even his cloak was not singed. It turned out that the player had a barrier of non-existence, and such childish pranks could not harm him. The hero also noted that the young man was able to dodge the blow of the doppelgangers by putting a doll in his place. It was a good move. The young man understood that his opponent was very strong and could see right through him. But the hero claimed that this was just a conclusion based on the current situation. The young man tried not to lose heart, claiming that he too could achieve something thanks to his luck, although he himself understood what he could achieve. But not in today's fight. The hero replied that luck is as much a part of skill as strength or intelligence, but relying solely on luck is very unwise. The hero himself possessed absolutely all possible achievements and abilities to the maximum extent, and thanks to this, he coped so well with the task at hand. And now the hero was going to hammer this information into the young man's head by any means available to him. He would do very well with the help of water's capabilities, and it would also be natural energy, which would immediately restore lost strength. And all the power of fire would also come to the hero's aid. Takahashi agreed that it was foolish to rely solely on luck all the time. The guy managed to notice one peculiarity. When the hero showed his levels, something caught the young man's attention. The hero's luck was almost at its lowest level. He could use this as his only weapon. The young man did not want to do anything that would disgrace him in front of his loved ones. But now was not the time to think about such trifles, because loved ones would always understand and forgive. But if he couldn't save them and his worst fear came true, related to his mother's death from illness in a past life, or the unfortunate fate of his sister, which was the result of the young man's inaction. For the sake of these women, as well as for himself, he was now ready to endure any trial that the hero would throw at him. Of course, the world is cruel and unfair, and perhaps Yukita will have to come to terms with this reality, because the hero is too strong. But the young man decided to take advantage of his opponent's low luck level and prepared to accept the challenge and fight. Before doing so, he activated his teleportation bracelet. Of course, there was always the possibility that the teleportation would not be approved and would not take place. But, believing in his accompanying luck, Yukita was going to defeat the hero and chose a place to teleport to. Despite the low probability, the bracelet of changeability worked, and he was allowed to use it just as the hero's attack was approaching him. Fire, water, and explosive power touched the young man just as he disappeared, leaving an empty space behind him. The guy teleported to the city street and found himself among the flow of cars and people. The hero was right there and noted that the bracelet of changeability was indeed a useful thing. The hero himself did not have such a bracelet, but he had enough flying magic to keep up with his opponent. He apologized for announcing so abruptly and without warning that they would now fight right there on the city streets. The young man believed that if the hero had decided to test him, then he also had the right to test the hero in return, because a true hero would not involve innocent people in the battle. The best of the adventurous players watched his enterprising opponent with interest, guessing what the young man had in mind. The player was indeed a hero, and his duty was first and foremost to protect people and not harm them, so he could not use mass magic. This was a significant concession, and a chance to hold out for the planned 10 minutes. Yukita's chances had increased significantly. The hero announced that he would not fight with a sword in order to avoid harming civilians. However, there was no need to worry about the hero, because he still had a huge arsenal of various skills and items at his disposal. With that, he fired flaming arrows that were supposed to hit the enemy precisely and lead to the hero winning the bet. Yukita also hid his silver slime sword and chose an item with which he intended to fight. That item was a shield. Looking at the shield in his opponent's hands, the hero was overcome with nostalgic memories of when he also had to fight with such a primitive item. In his past life, he often fought enemies who used crowds as shields. Now, the hero sent fire arrows that were supposed to shatter the shield into pieces. The arrows flew through the streets and did not cause any damage. They moved purposefully after the young man, who was maneuvering between people. Some of the arrows hit the walls or the ground, but did not hit anyone. Takahashi, once again avoiding being hit by covering himself with his shield, ran into a doorway. The arrow followed him relentlessly, but when it hit the young man, it was deflected and flew chaotically to the side. A gas pipe suddenly appeared in its path and was damaged. The hero noticed the situation, which was becoming literally explosive for the city's residents, and rushed to fix the gas leak to avoid an explosion. The hero brought down a rockfall on the presumed site of the fire, extinguishing it and preventing a catastrophe. Yukita continued to maneuver, moving through the streets of the city and trying to figure out how to use it for his own purposes. The guy spent most of his past life underground, and the city was just a place to get food. Therefore, Yukita remembered little about his past life, but now he had completely different ideals and goals for which he was ready to fight. The hero, intending to use his fists, which should have helped in the current situation, said that he would like to reminisce about his past life with the young man. But the boy managed to hide again, and the hero's fist slammed into the asphalt. Yukita's past life was like that of a worm constantly trying to crawl on the ground, and now he was grateful for the chance to live a new life. But then, the hero's blow pulled him out from under the car. The shield slightly reduced the damage, but the young man still flew through the streets and crashed into the corner of a building with all his might. However, he immediately jumped up and prepared for another dash, saying that he felt more comfortable in confined spaces. The hero continued to laugh at his opponent, calling him a coward and predicting his imminent defeat. Takahashi noticed a skateboard lying on the street, and taking advantage of it, jumped on the board and rolled away, covering himself with his shield and maneuvering between people. The hero realized that the guy had run away from him again, and it was starting to get annoying, because the player was going to finish off the young man very quickly. The hero said he just wanted to make sure the young man was worthy of his name, special. But the guy seems to be nothing more than a coward, and now the hero has drawn fiery rays in the shape of a 5-pointed star, which were supposed to catch up with the coward. Yukita was racing on his skateboard when a fiery net appeared in front of him, and the boy began to think about how to quickly use it to his advantage. A brilliant idea came to him, as always, quickly, and without ceasing to taunt his opponent, he declared that their battle would soon be over, if that was all the hero was capable of. The young man noticed a pole with a rubber grate that was placed over the pole at the point of leakage or breakage, and realized that he needed to use this cover from fire and lightning. The guy crept up to the pipe and hit the clamp with all his might, hoping that the damaged pole would not withstand his blow. Luck was again on Yukita's side, and a new crack immediately formed. Feeling that his idea was working perfectly, a new wave of confidence swept over the boy. The situation developed in such a way that the huge pole began to tilt and was about to fall directly onto the pedestrian crossing, crushing the people passing underneath and the cars standing there. The hero could not allow such a situation to happen and cause casualties among the civilian population, so he was forced to rush to the pillar and hold it in the air, preventing disaster from happening. As expected of a brave hero, he did everything he could to prevent innocent people from being hurt, earning applause from Yukita. After this situation, the hero admitted that the guy really surprised him with his ingenuity and ability to create complex situations. Well, if the hero is obliged to protect people at all costs, then the young man destroyed another pole, breaking the high-voltage electrical wires. Together with the gas escaping from the pipe, the electricity caused a powerful explosion that lit up the entire neighborhood and shook the city with its force. And now, all of the hero's water abilities were activated, and with the help of the goddess of water, he set about extinguishing the fire. His water ability did an excellent job, dousing the fire and extinguishing all the scattered sparks and flames. Yukita continued to laugh at the hero, suggesting that more water was needed to solve the problem. The situation was indeed dire. Cars, trees, streets, and houses were engulfed in flames. Looking at the situation, the hero was forced to activate natural forces and the gnome builder to avoid damage and restore what had been destroyed. Surprisingly, seeing the suffering of the people, the hero could not stand aside and rushed to save the city together with his doppelgangers. Soon, all his abilities were put to use to restore order in the city. The wounded and sick were immediately healed, and the destruction was repaired. When order was restored, Nikita turned to the hero, saying that he was still there and ready to continue their duel. The hero, busy saving the city and restoring what had been destroyed, said he had no time for the young man. Besides, his opponent was incapable of inflicting any damage on the hero. Perhaps Yukita was not capable of defeating the strongest adventurer player, but he still had a few ideas and was not going to stop halfway. The young man understood that he could create circumstances in which the hero would be harmed, and as the protagonist, he took advantage of the situation. He pushed the famous hero right into the sewer, which was leaking where the drain pipes had burst. It was truly an ironic picture. The best of the best players found himself in water full of excrement. Takahashi had no intention of saving the hero and, on the contrary, struck another blow with the silver slime sword to show the boastful player what it was like to be at the bottom. Sitting in a pit full of sewage, the hero couldn't believe what was happening. How dare this newcomer treat him this way? But in response, Yukita declared that he wasn't done yet and prepared to use magic with his wand of absurdity. And we remember that this magic could be completely unpredictable. The hero remembered this, of course, and raised both hands in the air, announcing that he was giving up the fight and conceding victory to the young man. When the streets of the city were cleaned up and the hero himself was pulled out of the manure pit with the help of his assistants, the best player admitted that due to his bad luck, he often faced similar situations. The hero had expected that something like this might happen in their fight, but he had not expected such a complete defeat. For the first time in his life, so many misfortunes had happened at once, and now all his abilities were actively trying to repair the damage. All these explosions reminded him of an accident from his past life, when gas exploded in his house. Many people died, and the townspeople brought flowers and mementos to the scene of the tragedy. Painful memories from the past came in handy for victory this time, but the main thing that happened in today's fight was that Yukita was able to prove to the hero that he was capable of preventing the past from repeating itself. The hero applauded and acknowledged that the evidence was more than convincing. Therefore, the hero decided to allow the family to spend a little more time with Nozomi, who was alive and unharmed. The hero announced that, unfortunately, the non-existence would soon come to an end, as it was only granted for a short period of time, and the player would have to deal with all the consequences that remained in the city. Takahashi would have to return to the hospital to his family, who had no idea that he was gone. In the future, the young man would have to deal with the curse of the disaster. Yukita did not understand what the hero meant by this expression and what meaning he put into the words curse of the disaster. The hero said that it was because of this curse that the tragedy in the hospital had happened, but this hint again meant nothing to the young man. The hero was genuinely surprised and did not understand how the boy could not know about it, since he had come from the future and the disaster at the hospital was known to all the city's residents. But the fact remained. The hero had to tell him everything in detail. Takahashi had no idea what had happened, because he had spent most of his past life underground, destroying silver slimes and communicating with absolutely no one. It was surprising, but the player realized that the young man was not joking and really knew nothing about the disaster at the hospital. Then a terrible tragedy occurred. Explosions and fires destroyed buildings, roads were destroyed, and many people died. The young man had to admit that he had spent his past life in the dungeons, and all this time he had been interested only in slimes. It was sad, but now he had a chance for a new life. However, it was also strange. He remembered absolutely nothing about such a tragedy. The hero realized that in this case, Yukita didn't even know how to resist the curse. The protagonist had no idea what was going on, what curse needed to be defeated, or what the meaning of the catastrophe that now needed to be prevented was. The hero was tired of talking to the guy and said that he didn't have time to explain the details anyway, because existence was about to collapse. And indeed, soon the sky began to look normal, and reality regained its realism. The hero only had time to tell Takahashi to go to the morgue, located in the basement of the hospital. Once there, the young man would understand everything himself. The young man did not understand why he should listen to the hero and go solve problems that had nothing to do with him. In response, the hero simply said that he would try to deal with the problem himself. But if nothing is done, many people will die, and the hero now needs to repair the damage caused on the street as a result of their duel. Takahashi didn't have time to ask anything else, but he clearly understood that a huge catastrophe was coming. With a large number of human casualties, there was no one left to ask further questions, because the hero rushed off to fulfill his duties, and the nothingness almost dissipated. Still not understanding what was happening, the young man realized that he had to return to the hospital anyway. After all, he had left his mother and sister there. The guy activated his teleportation bracelet just as the nothingness ended. The streets of the city looked completely normal. People were calmly going about their business. Cars were driving on the road, and there were no signs of an impending disaster. The attending physician was finishing his recommendations. He advised the woman to undergo regular checkups and lead a healthy lifestyle so that she would not have to come back to them in the future. The young man realized that the process of saying goodbye and parting would be a long one, and he didn't have time to explain the situation because he himself didn't fully understand what might happen. So the young man decided to quietly go to the basement, but first he realized that he couldn't leave his relatives in the hospital. He needed to get his mother and sister out of the clinic building as soon as possible. Nozomi announced that she was very hungry. His mother suggested stopping at a cafe on the way home to have a bite to eat and celebrate the happy news of her recovery. However, Yukito reminded them that he would cook dinner for them himself to celebrate the occasion. The young man claimed that he could easily handle the task, but now he asked his mother and sister to go to the store and buy all the necessary ingredients for dinner. His family decided not to deny him the opportunity to treat them and agreed to buy all the necessary ingredients. Yukito was happy that he had so easily gotten his ladies out of a dangerous place, and now he could calmly tackle a problem he had no idea how to solve. The young man went to the morgue but first decided to go to the bathroom to prepare himself. Entering the stall, he put on the invisibility cloak he had received as a trophy for defeating the bandit. The young man had already worn this cloak several times to avoid encounters with weak monsters. He would never have thought that this cloak would come in handy in real life, but the situation was such that he had to use it. One of the visitors to the restroom decided that there was a ghost in the stall. Because the door opened, he clearly heard footsteps, but saw no one. Of course, Yukito didn't fully trust the hero's words, but he couldn't ignore them, so he had to check for himself what was going on in the morgue. The young man had never heard of the curse of the disaster, but the hero claimed that once he arrived at the morgue, he would understand everything. The protagonist took the elevator down to the lower floor of the hospital and walked through the corridors of the completely empty basement. It was as quiet as a coffin, and nothing foreshadowed the impending disaster. Soon the young man reached the right part of the corridor. Before entering the morgue, he decided to check if there was anyone alive on the floor and used his locator. It turned out that there was no one on the floor. It was completely empty. The guy took out and prepared his silver slime sword and entered the morgue. The morgue was quiet, empty, and gloomy. The young man moved from one room to another, not understanding what he needed to find. Looking at the bodies of dead people lying on stretchers, covered with sheets, Yukito thought that one day he would also end up here. After going through all the rooms in the morgue, the young man found nothing and no one, and even decided that perhaps the hero was just playing a joke on him. Suddenly, a terrible sound, the creaking of a gurney moving across the stone floor, made the young man jump in surprise. Following this sound, the sheets began to fall from the bodies of the dead, and these people were no longer completely dead. The entire room where the young man was standing was filled with the risen dead, who, despite their injuries and lack of life, were moving toward him. They wheezed horribly, moaned, and reached out their dead, disgusting hands toward the guy, and Yukito realized that the disaster would involve zombies. The encounter with the zombies was very strange, because usually the strongest seekers challenged the floor with the undead. But there was no point in thinking about it, and Takahashi began to chop the zombies with his sword, believing that their appearance was the result of some kind of curse. The young man knew that if an adventurer was cursed before death and not buried in time, he would become a zombie. Now, for some reason, all these former players were attacking him specifically. They were trying to get to the guy to devour him. The number of zombies did not decrease, and the young man realized that the curse could spread to neighboring corpses. Therefore, the bodies of ordinary people in the city morgue also came to life and became undead. In the past, the souls of the dead were put to sleep with the help of holy power, but in the modern world, no one did that. The only consolation was that the curse did not spread to living people, unless, of course, they managed to avoid being bitten by zombies. Takahashi decided to build some kind of barrier and use the metal stretchers on which the dead bodies usually lay. He lifted the stretchers and made a barricade out of them. He had to be extremely careful and attentive to avoid any contact with the zombies. The young man was a strong player and skilled with a sword, which he used to destroy the zombies, but their numbers did not decrease. He managed to reduce the number of attackers slightly and slow down their influx by building a protective fence. But this was not a permanent solution to the problem. One of the zombies had a gold token, probably a famous adventurer in life who ended up as a walking dead. One of the zombie's hands reached through the gap between the beds, and its sharp nails nearly wounded the young man. Suddenly, the door to the next room burst open, and a new wave of zombies attacked the young man from behind. The young man dealt with one of the dead, cutting off the walking corpse's head with his sword. This was no problem for him. The guy swung his sword over the body of the female zombie, intending to behead her, when suddenly something caught his attention. The radar showed that this zombie was not a villain and was marked as a neutral target. It turned out that the girl had not yet been turned into a zombie. At that moment, the stranger turned her face, full of horror, toward the young man and screamed for help. The girl was in shock from what was happening around her. Yukito was also frightened. He did not expect the zombie to be able to talk to him, and realized that the girl was alive, just very scared and covered in someone else's blood. She must have been an employee of the funeral home and had come to the morgue to collect the bodies, but suddenly fell victim to a zombie attack. It was known that it was impossible to turn a zombie back into a human. However, if the bite was recent, there was still a chance to save her. but the young man did not have the necessary tools to help. In addition, the barricade of beds did not inspire confidence, and it was clear that the zombies would destroy it soon. Therefore, letting the girl die seemed the most logical solution. Then he would have to focus on eliminating the main threat, as the bulk of the zombies were advancing more and more aggressively. Takahashi thought about how he didn't want to be a player who was driven solely by efficiency and the desire to earn points for destroying monsters for items. So the guy opened his profile and decided to use the tools at hand. Activating his teleportation bracelet, the young man went to the store and bought the alchemical tools he needed to save the girl. Then he went to the sorceress and got a recipe for a healing potion from her. After studying the recipe and the technique for creating a potion against the zombie curse in the book, Yukito was convinced that even he understood everything. He returned to the morgue and approached the girl for whom he was going to make the life-saving potion. She was still in a transitional stage and couldn't harm the boy, so he used his sword to make a cut on her finger. The healing potion was made individually for each person, and that person's blood was required by the recipe. Yukito collected a few drops of blood in a flask. Soon, all the ingredients needed to make the potion were gathered and prepared. The young man performed all the steps exactly as indicated in the Book of Magic Recipes and waited, hoping that the potion would work. Despite his lack of magical skills, the sacred purification elixir was soon complete. He collected the potion in a flask and carefully poured it into the mouth of the girl, who was supposed to return to human form. As soon as the potion entered her body, the girl's body underwent a magical transformation. Her arms and legs gradually began to take on a normal human form. It seemed that the medicine had worked and the purification had taken place. However, the girl was exhausted, and Yukito sat her down so that she could recover and not fall victim to the zombies again. After that, the guy decided it was time to deal with the main mass of undead that was waiting for him behind the barrier. To his surprise, he found that there was no one in the morgue. Everything was quiet again, and the zombies had disappeared somewhere. Entering one of the morgue rooms, the guy saw a horrific scene. A huge, incomprehensible creature was devouring the zombies, biting off half their bodies and swallowing them like nuts. This monster looked completely unreal. Some kind of bodies with open mouths glowing green and bulging eyes with expressions of horror. The next second, the young man saw a huge jaw, wide open and lined with long, sharp fangs. He couldn't see the whole creature yet. Gradually, Takahashi realized that this was not just a monster. It was some kind of walking abomination. He understood that while he was busy creating a potion and treating the girl, the curse had united and become stronger. Now he was facing an unprecedented monster, a biomass made up of different body parts. At the front, a huge skull with fangs crowned this mass, and it was impossible to count the number of limbs. Takahashi remembered the hero who had sent him here, and imagined what he would look like in his place. Probably, the hero would not look so cheerful now. There was no time to wait. The monster continued to grow, devouring zombies and merging with them. The young man rushed into the attack, not regretting for a second that he had spent time saving the girl. By this point, the creature had developed nasty tentacles resembling octopus tentacles, only covered with disgusting growths and warts along their entire length. The young man attacked the silver slime with his sword, and with a light movement cut off one of the monster's heads. He knew that the only way to kill a zombie was to destroy its head, so he aimed there, cutting them off with a single movement. However, this monster had many heads. Even after losing one head, the monster did not lose its strength and continued to attack. The nasty tentacles caused a lot of trouble. They were flexible, and the young man had to constantly dodge to avoid contact. Fortunately, the sword cut them off quite easily. The battle tactic was obvious. He had to cut off the heads until there were none left. But even after losing all its heads, the monster did not die. On the contrary, it grew even larger and became simply gigantic. Its hideous jaws, with its mouth wide open and glowing eyes, now took up almost the entire space. The number and length of its tentacles were astonishing. They filled the entire room, preventing the young man from reaching the monster's torso. The tentacles picked up the zombie bodies throughout the room and threw them straight into the monster's mouth. Soon, new heads grew back on the creature's body, and the whole fight turned out to be useless. The monster only got stronger. The young man realized that the undead were healing, even though any other zombie would have rotted away long ago. After observing the monster, Yukito realized that he had to cut off the last head before the others regenerated. But a new problem arose. The boy's combat skills were designed for close combat, and he did not know how to attack from a distance. He could have used the Staff of Absurdity, but this artifact often caused more problems than it solved. Moreover, its use could destroy the entire hospital. causing enormous casualties among civilians. Yukito thought about stalling for time and waiting for the hero to join the battle. But he didn't want to lose to the arrogant blonde. With every passing minute, it became clear that waiting was not an option. The monster continued to grow. Any delay played into its hands. There were enough zombie bodies to satisfy its hunger, and if he hesitated, it would grow to unimaginable proportions. Takahashi activated his abilities and rushed into the attack. He chopped off tentacles and fought his way to the head, repeating to himself that he had to deal with the monster right now and not let it grow. If it continued to devour its own kind, soon no one would be able to stop it. But to defeat such a monster, he needed something that could destroy all the zombies at once, without destroying the hospital. The young man knew he didn't have such a thing, so for now, he was only doing minimal damage, trying to slow the monster's growth. Dodging another tentacle, Yukito noticed his alchemy kit, which he had recently used to create medicine. After all, it could be used to make more than just potions. If something didn't exist, it could be created. With this thought in mind, the young man began to gather materials from the morgue. Even a pipe or a stone could be a useful weapon. Soon he got hold of several iron legs from a bed. Dodging a tentacle, the boy grabbed a steel plate that had previously been part of a wheelchair. Then he took his shield out of his inventory. The young man covered himself with the shield, hoping that the creature would slow down and not act as aggressively as before. The monster attacked him with its tentacles, but the guy, shielding himself with the shield, was able to cross the room and reach the desired item. This time, he once again became the owner of a book containing recipes not only for potions, but also for other useful substances. The young man studied the list of ingredients for making black powder. Of course, he didn't have the necessary chemicals on hand, but that didn't mean they couldn't be created. He could have used his bracelet to teleport to the store, but it was completely out of energy. Throughout the day, Yukito had used the bracelet repeatedly and used up all its energy, so he decided to create the ingredients himself. There was no problem with charcoal. There were pieces of broken furniture scattered throughout the room that could be used to make it. Takahashi threw the wooden pieces into the alchemy kit, and soon the process of turning them into charcoal was complete. However, creating sulfur and potassium nitrate proved to be completely beyond him. The young man did not know where to start or how to make them, and at the same time, he had to fend off the monster, avoiding its tentacles. Modern technology came to the rescue. Using his cell phone and internet access, the young man studied information about the creation and substitutes for the necessary substances. The almighty internet suggested that sulfur could be obtained from matches. Yukito himself did not have any. He did not smoke, but he remembered that the girl he had saved had a purse. Perhaps there were matches in it. Luck once again smiled on the lucky guy. He did indeed find a box. The young man threw the matches into the alchemy kit and started the process of creating sulfur and potassium nitrate. A few minutes later, the desired components were ready for use. Now he could start making black powder. He had all the necessary ingredients. After a short time, the vial with the desired substance was in the hands of its creator. But this was not the final product he needed. From the gunpowder he obtained, he soon made high-quality shiny bullets that promised to solve many problems. It was time to move on to the next stage. Yukito took a pen and a notebook to make the necessary calculations and notes. Meanwhile, the monster did not relent, continuing to grow and fiercely attack the young man. The situation seemed hopeless, but the young man tore a sheet of paper from his notebook, realizing that he would soon create the most effective weapon against zombies. He threw away the pen and notebook and dropped the sheet of paper into the alchemy kit. The monster, watching his actions, could not guess what this would lead to. Yukito took the metal legs from the wheelchair out of his inventory. They were to become the basis for a new recipe. The alchemy began. Something fiery and wild boiled in the cauldron, and the air filled with the smell of metal and magic. A few more moments, and the process was complete. The guy became the owner of 2 homemade sawed-off shotguns. Of course, he didn't want to desecrate the bodies of the dead hunters, but he had no choice. Yukito loaded the sawed-off shotguns with freshly made bullets filled with black powder. He was ready to finish off the monster and aimed his deadly weapon at it. Several shots rang out. Although the guy's shooting skills were poor, luck was on his side again. By that point, the monster had grown to such a size that it was simply impossible to miss. Every shot hit its target. All the hits were critical and produced the expected result. A few minutes later, the monster collapsed to the floor, turning into a pile of bodies. It still tried to resist, lunging its tentacles at the young man, but another bullet put an end to it. When the ammunition ran out, the body of the huge creature lay motionless, showing no signs of life. Soon, a system notification appeared. Yukito Takahashi destroyed the Curse of Catastrophe and became the first player to achieve this. For his victory, the young man received the title of Holy Assassin. He breathed a sigh of relief. The battle had been incredibly difficult, but he had prevailed. At that moment, the girl sitting on the morgue floor coughed. Yukito realized she was alive. The medicine had worked. She had completely returned to human form. This was good news, but new problems were already beginning to form in the guy's head. He had to come up with an explanation for why he was in the morgue with a weapon and covered in blood, since he was not a hospital employee. In addition, trespassing on hospital property and using a weapon outside the dungeons could lead to serious trouble. First, Yukito put on his invisibility cloak, but suddenly there was a noise behind the door, and the guy realized that his problems were just beginning. One of the knights in a helmet ordered the locators to be activated and checked to see if there were any survivors in the room. The young man hastily threw on his cloak, realizing that he would not have time to hide completely. The warrior's stealth skills were weak, and this threatened to cause him great trouble. The bracelet's energy had not yet been restored, and it was impossible to use the teleportation function. Yukito looked at the bracelet imploringly, hoping that luck would help him escape at least once. But this time, no miracle happened. The teleportation didn't work, and the doors suddenly swung open. Huge knights in heavy armor holding spears burst into the room. Behind them, several more warriors entered the hall carrying a throne in their arms. When they placed it on the floor, a young girl in white papal robes appeared on the seat, holding a phone in her hands. They were clergymen. Their mistress, dressed in a sacred cloak, was a priestess named Naomi. The priestess, without taking her eyes off the phone, declared that the stranger looked like an atheist. Although she did not know this for sure, he clearly looked suspicious. After that, the girl put her phone down on the ground and, crossing her fingers at chest level, began to pray that the kingdom of heaven would bring more bonuses to its servants. The priestess also prayed that she would not meet her doom at the hands of immoral donors. Needless to say, the prayer was very specific. After finishing her prayer for a level up in some game, Naomi approached the young man and stared at him, trying to figure out if he was an enemy of God. Yukito was at a loss for words. He had never met such representatives of the church before, so he just mumbled something incomprehensible in response, and pointed to the mountain of zombie corpses. The priestess guessed that the guy was most likely an adventurous player, and that he had killed these rebels. However, the next question turned out to be quite ambiguous. Naomi wanted to know how the young man had found out about the zombies in the hospital basement, since he didn't look like an employee of the institution. The priestess assumed that the player could sense the undead even better than she could, but that was practically impossible. At that moment, the door flew open, and the hero appeared in the doorway, declaring to everyone that he had sensed the impending danger and sent Yukito here. The clergy, along with the priestess, immediately recognized the hero and paid him their respects. The hero himself explained his absence from the battle with the zombies by saying that he had to deal with accidents in the city. Upon learning that Yukito was personally acquainted with the hero, the priestess stopped doubting the young man and realized that he was not an enemy of God and should no longer be suspected. In addition, Naomi sensed that the young man had rather low karma. Yukito did not understand what this meant, as he was hearing about it for the first time. The priestess explained that she was able to see other people's sins, as well as their good and bad deeds, in numerical values. She had made her conclusion based on this data. Takahashi realized that Naomi possessed a rare skill related to a specific field of activity. After that, the priestess turned to the hero, who was the best adventurer of all times and peoples, with a question about whether the unfamiliar young man would take part in the upcoming sacred battle. The hero immediately confirmed this, stating that it would be very useful for the priestess and would not disappoint her. The hero was confident that Yukito would cleanse the walls of the temple from the shackles of evil, bringing God's grace there. The priestess confirmed that the hero's recommendations were valuable, and therefore the young man would go with her. Naomi needed anyone in her service as long as they were capable of being useful, and she did not care who that person was. Yukito did not understand what was going on and was outraged by the fact that no one in the room even tried to ask his personal opinion. After these words and the player's sincere objection, the hero leaned low to his ear and suggested they go outside and talk away from everyone else. The young men retired to a back room of the morgue, and the hero made an unusual request, or perhaps even an order, to the young man. He asked Yukito to look after the priestess in his place, because it had become necessary. The hero was sure that the young man had heard about the temple class change, which took place in one of the dungeons, and was very useful for adventurous players. If a player wanted to develop their class and increase their importance, or, conversely, change it, the temple could help with this. The hero admitted that in his past life, he was unable to save the temple due to the impending disaster. As a result, the priestess Naomi was killed and her staff of power was broken. Due to the fall of the temple, adventurers and players around the world were greatly weakened, while the power of the enemy who captured the temple, on the contrary, increased. Takahashi was surprised that the hero, who knew all this, did not want to take it upon himself to resolve the situation in order to correct the mistakes of the past and prevent the temple from falling in this life. The hero claimed that he would gladly take on this task, but he cannot because there are still many threats in the world that he must prevent for the sake of a peaceful future. Takahashi tried to understand what this had to do with him and why he had to fight instead of the hero, because the young man had his own plans for his future life. The hero began to tempt the young man with future prospects. By connecting with the church and doing something truly important and meaningful for it, the player would be able to go deeper into the dungeons. This progress would be achieved through instant teleportation between floors and powerful barriers. The church monopolized everyone capable of using healing and support magic, and these people fought under its wing. Mages and healers could create powerful barriers in certain areas and move adventurers between floors using teleportation magic. This was a really tempting offer for a new player because it gave him a huge chance to boost his stats in a short time. So Yukita agreed right away. The guy confirmed his participation in the battle instead of the hero, but in return demanded that he swear not to lay a finger on his family. The hero agreed to take the oath, claiming that he had no intention of harming those who were useful to this world. Yukita understood that the unprincipled hero would get rid of him as soon as the young man ceased to be useful. The hero continued to insist that he was simply asking for a little help, but Yukita made it seem as if the hero was threatening him. The rest of the conversation proved pointless, and the players made a secret agreement between themselves. After that, Yukita asked the hero to tell him what he would have to face in this battle, but the hero did not have time to explain, although it was clear that he was not going to do so in order not to scare the young man away. Their conversation was interrupted by the priestess Naomi. The clergy began cleaning the hospital basement and morgue because they had been desecrated, and they sent the surviving woman to the hospital to recover. After that, the priestess activated her abilities and pointed her staff at Takahashi. A cloud of black energy immediately formed around him. Naomi sensed this and announced that the whole group would now go to the nearest temple. She sat down on her throne, picked up the game she had put aside for the time being, and announced that the boy's abilities would be assessed at the temple, because if he was not capable of fighting, there was no point in hiring such a person. Yukita had no choice but to go to the temple, because several churchmen immediately pointed their spears at him and escorted the young man, prodding him with their sharp tips. Yukita noticed how the hero quickly slipped out of the basement, taking advantage of the commotion and confusion, and realized that the hero had simply ditched him. It seemed that lunch would not be happening today. The nearest church was not far from the hospital, among the high-rise buildings and busy streets of the city. The churchgoers entered the building, took their places, and the priestess Naomi announced the start of the duel. The young man's opponent was to be an average subordinate. This subordinate's level was around 40, and he had almost no special skills. Yukita realized that the church official was stronger than him, but only slightly, so he still had a chance of winning. Both opponents took up their starting positions, and the fight began. The players eagerly entered the fray, and it was clear that they were conscientiously carrying out the priestess's instructions, intending to finish everything quickly and successfully. Attacks and counterattacks followed one after another. Takahashi attacked with the silver slime sword and realized that the clergyman's blows were rather weak. This was because the church warriors were mainly focused on defensive skills, as they were the priestess's personal bodyguards. The young man continued to strike and realized that even with the difference in levels, he was fighting better. He clearly had the upper hand in speed. The priestess realized this too, noting that the player was fighting quite well, but now it was time to change the situation a little. Naomi announced that she would show the player a glimpse of God's grace. She closed her eyes and called upon the higher powers. Then she tapped her staff on the floor and called upon them for help. At first glance, nothing unusual happened, but Yukita immediately sensed that the battle had taken a different turn. The clergyman's blows became significantly more powerful and faster, and his attacks more aggressive. The priestess, without distracting herself from the battle, wolfed down her sandwiches, enjoying the new tone of the battle after buffing the churchman. Takahashi knew that the church warriors had very high endurance and defense stats, and with buffs to their strength, the young man would not be able to withstand a protracted battle. He had to decide quickly in order to win as soon as possible. And then the player's gaze fell on the enemy's protective gloves. The young man noticed that the armor was quite thin, and that the parts were connected with rivets. After dodging another blow, he began to implement a new plan. Yukita thought it would be a sin not to take advantage of such a vulnerability, and covering himself with his shield began to act. He found a small metal fragment left over from some structure or part and decided it would suffice. At that moment, the churchman counterattacked and activated his Holy Hammer ability, intending to strike with his sword with both hands. At that moment, Yukita activated the Bee Sting skill and rushed towards his opponent. Soon they were close together and ready to strike each other, but the boy was quicker. His Bee Sting hit not the cleric's body, but his glove, and that was enough to break through his defense. After that, the young man activated Shield Strike and knocked his opponent off his feet, causing him to fall on his back. The clergyman lay on the floor, trembling, his hands raised, and one of his gloves was completely destroyed. Yukita approached his opponent, pressed his sword against his chest, and asked the priestess Naomi what to do next. The priestess had no intention of letting the fight go to the end, so she stopped the duel, saying she had seen enough. Yukita was indeed quite strong, and she sincerely congratulated him, praising him for his quick wits and success. Takahashi understood that he wasn't that strong. It was just that the church's warriors relied too much on their priestess's buffs and didn't show any initiative. After that, the priestess showed complete indifference to the player and announced that he could leave. They would meet later, and the girl herself became engrossed in the game again. It was only in the evening that Takahashi was able to get home. Approaching the house, he remembered that he had promised to prepare a festive dinner in honor of his mother's recovery. In a great hurry, but still gathering his strength, the young man managed to complete this task as well, preparing everything he could. The whole family was together and happy, despite the burnt dinner. Because the most important thing is the health and closeness of family and loved ones. The young man watched his mother and was happy that she had recovered, and that he could now do what he had failed to do in his previous life. The family had enough money, so Nozomi could enjoy her youth and did not need to go to work or rush into marriage for money. However, Takahashi understood that the day might come when he would no longer be needed by the hero, and the hero would break his word. But until that moment came, the boy had to become stronger than the hero. On the eve of an important battle, the priestess Naomi was alone, passing the next levels in her game. In addition, she actively participated in correspondence in various chat rooms to stay in the loop and keep her finger on the pulse of events. She preached to people who were far from faith, who wanted to see signs or miracles, but were only willing to believe when they saw the results with their own eyes. Right now, the priestess could only send them selfies. The girl understood that by indulging in worldly pleasures, people spoil their karma. However, she could not leave them alone, and therefore spoiled her karma along with them. A knock on the door interrupted her secular life. A group of churchmen entered the room, politely asking for her time and apologizing for disturbing her sacred solitude. One of the clergymen knelt before the priestess and informed her that the warriors needed to discuss the upcoming holy battle with her. On behalf of all the clergymen, he stated that they were categorically opposed to including an adventurer named Yukita Takahashi in their expedition. The players claimed that this adventurer's karma was too low, and that this posed a danger to absolutely everyone. Priestess Naomi listened to them with anguish, although in reality she was completely indifferent. All she wanted was to deepen her faith and purify her heart. But belonging to the temple inevitably involved internal strife. The church official continued to insist that the participation of adventurers in such battles did not bring anything good. The priestess also agreed with this, because the temple had carefully studied similar cases and come to a general conclusion. Groups with a high reputation had a much better chance of survival. So the temple introduced a hidden evaluation parameter. The strength of God's enemies now depended on it. That is, if a player with low karma entered the temple, their karma would increase the power of the villains. Therefore, clergymen, as servants of God with high karma, had a better chance of winning. In addition, Yukita himself warned that it was not worth relying solely on karma. Even if it is high, it is better to face the truth. All adventurers are sinful, and servants of God lead righteous lives. As soon as the servants of the church enter the temple, their high karma will weaken the enemy. Of course, not all of them are equally worthy of bringing peace to this world, but among the adventurers, in their opinion, there are only liars and criminals. It was impossible to disagree with this, and the priestess acknowledged that there was some truth in the warrior's words, but she had already given her word that she would take Takahashi into her service. Naomi had no intention of going back on her word, but the clergyman came up with a trick for her, because the priestess had not promised to fight alongside them. Therefore, it was indeed possible to take the adventurers with her, but it was not necessary to allow them into the temple. Naomi thought about it for a while, and made a decision that coincided with the request of her subordinates. She announced that the adventurers would not participate in the holy war. The priestess really wanted to do everything possible to free the temple from the clutches of evil and vice, and now her church warriors would take care of it with honor. The players were very pleased with the outcome of their appeal to the priestess, and satisfied with her decision, because the priestess, who was a child, was very easy to manipulate. As befits a saint, Naomi was trusting and posed no danger. She was easy to control. The warriors were convinced that they themselves must protect the innocent from the enemies of God, and that the adventurers must not be allowed to become even more powerful. The priestess's rise was inevitable, and they needed to get more subsidies from the temple. Those were the plans for the near future. A short time passed, and the day of the holy battle arrived, in which Takahashi Yukita was to take part. The guild manager informed the player that he had been appointed leader of the adventurers and was responsible for them. This was new to him, as the young man usually fought and cleared dungeons alone. The first floor of the Tokyo dungeon, the Indelible Trace, was a temple of God located in a wonderful place surrounded by meadows and mountains. Wonderful sunny weather greeted the participants. In the dungeon, Yukita met a priestess and reminded her that they had not yet discussed battle tactics in the temple. Naomi greeted the players and withdrew, surrounded by her warriors, showing no interest in conversation or planning. The young man had a bad feeling, but he needed to get to know the adventurers, whose leader he now was. The young man bowed his head to the players in greeting and apologized for becoming their leader, even though he had not known them before. However, the adventurers were very friendly to Yukita and welcomed him warmly. They told the young man not to worry and expressed their trust in him, since the hero himself had recommended Takahashi. One of the participants said that they were all very grateful to the hero, which Yukita found strange. He asked what they were grateful for. The players believed that they would have rotted away in prison long ago if it weren't for the hero. Every day, he proved himself to be an exemplary hero and tried to make everyone happy, as well as giving a second chance to those who were in prison for the first time. After greetings and pleasantries, the priestess announced that to begin the sacred mission, the participants must go to the temple on the 30th floor. The church had built temples on each level of the dungeon, and they were considered safe zones that players could use. Inside these temples, players were provided with a range of services that usually cost considerable donations. The first floor of the temple was in ruins, which was not surprising. At the very beginning of the journey, no one needed help. All the players gathered in the center of the temple in front of the priestess. Naomi activated magical transportation between floors and dungeons, so that players would not have to waste time and energy on their way to the main battle. In the next moment, the entire group was transported to the 30th floor. The dungeon on this level was an endless polar night. The floor was lit by the dim light of the aurora borealis, and at first, the players admired this unreal natural phenomenon. There were almost no monsters on the floor, very few resources, and no boss at all. The players moved around the dungeon, admiring the northern lights. They noticed that the zombies and goblins did not react to them at all and looked as if they were frozen. Recently, adventurers did not usually linger on the 30th floor because it was almost impossible to earn anything there, and there were no important items to be found. Soon the group reached the temple, which looked very beautiful. Pink and lilac hues shimmered in its windows, and the northern lights perfectly complemented the picture. Takahashi once again tried to find out from the priestess what their plan was for taking the temple. Naomi announced that their task was to defeat all the demons that had taken up residence within the sacred walls, and were preventing the holy church from taking its rightful place. She then turned to the adventurers and ordered them to remain outside the temple until the assault was over. This greatly surprised the players, who were looking forward to battle. The church warriors asked the adventurers not to take this personally, because due to the low karma of the participants, engaging in battle with the demons would be dangerous for everyone. The warriors wanted to deal with this evil themselves, and hoped that they would have enough strength, as their high karma should weaken the enemy. The hero managed to warn Yukira about this, saying that karma is one of the most unreliable indicators. There were many loopholes that allowed karma to be lowered, and hypocrites who had settled in temples took advantage of this. These people manipulated the priestess Naomi for their own dirty purposes, and therefore had to be destroyed to put an end to this. But the hero understood that if a large number of people from the temple died at the same time, it would cause a great commotion. The situation was truly dire. In addition to villains and demons, they also had to fight unworthy people within the church. Takahashi turned to the priestess, saying that they, the adventurers, had obligations to the guild. He decided to break through her ban on participating in the battle. Yukita argued that adventurers could not perform their duties half-heartedly, because it would damage their reputation. The clergy promised that the priestess Naomi would personally inform the guild that the players had fulfilled their duty to the fullest, and would definitely receive the promised reward. However, If anyone was against this arrangement, they could leave the dungeon right now. It was very generous of the temple to pay the full amount for work that the players had not even done. The young man crumpled up the check he had received from the clergy. And as unfair as it was, the adventurers at this level of the dungeon were only acting as reinforcements and had no say in the matter. After that, all the preparatory issues were resolved, and the church warriors began the sacred battle, joining forces to fight the enemy of God. After that, the group of God's warriors went to the temple, leaving the adventurer players alone and completely confused. The players began to discuss the situation, and some of them accepted the fact that they had done their job and could now rest. Other players doubted that it was normal to be paid for doing nothing. Yukito pondered this because he knew from his past life that all these sanctimonious people would soon perish. But the young man did not know how to convince the adventurers to save everyone. Maybe it wasn't worth saving them at all, and these doubts and worries really upset Yukito. The problem was the blonde hero who had dumped this situation on the young man, and was now calmly entertaining himself somewhere in the city, paving roads and planting new trees. Soon, the church warriors, led by the priestess Naomi, entered the temple. In the center of the temple, where the altar was usually located, stood a huge statue of a nun, and in front of it was a large group of all kinds of monsters and beasts. These monsters, beasts and goblins, did not move at all, just like the other monsters on this floor. The priestess also noticed this oddity, which was that the monsters did not attack the players. There were very few of them, and they did not try to harm people. The church warriors rushed into the attack, deciding that they needed to kill the monsters before they turned around and noticed the people. But this action triggered the activation of evil, and the statue that stood motionless in place of the altar seemed to come to life. Bloody tears flowed from its eyes, and a black hole appeared where its mouth had been. It opened its arms, inviting the uninvited guests to become its worshippers, and opened its arms to them. The churchgoers realized that this was an enemy of God, but they were sure that, as servants of God with pure souls, evil should not have come upon them. Could it be that there was a person with low karma among them, and his presence in the temple had activated the enemy of God? Of course, one of them was very fond of expensive cars, and the gambler regularly spent large sums of the company's money on them, while the second warrior simply loved to eat well and saw no problem with that, because good nutrition is important for a warrior's health. Another churchgoer was convinced that fornication was bad, but divorce and infidelity were perfectly normal, because everyone did it, and it was just a small sin. Thus it turned out that all these men of God had committed enough minor sins to awaken the enemy of God. The priestess remembered that the hero had warned her about this, and he was right. Naomi ordered her subordinates to stop searching for the culprit and focus on the enemy ahead. The churchmen agreed with the priestess and decided to start the battle, because as long as Lady Naomi was on their side, they had nothing to fear. The priestess immediately activated her prayers to buff the players. For a while it helped, and the warriors began to fight the monsters more vigorously, but soon their enthusiasm faded. The monsters turned out to be unusual. They were very different from those found in other places. Their ferocity, strength, and power were many times greater. The priestess, activating her powers, ordered the warriors not to rush to conclusions, because these monsters lived on the 30th floor, and the clergy had already reached the 40th floor and defeated them there. Magical power continued to flow from the priestess to the clergyman. God's warriors once again believed that they were much stronger than the monsters, and rushed into the attack. But God's enemy was not asleep either, and became more and more active, helping his servants and strengthening their power. Goblins, monsters, and beasts rushed into the attack on the clergy with new strength and struck them with their power. It became clear that something was strengthening the enemy with every passing minute, and this was an absolutely unprecedented phenomenon. Naomi understood that with each adventurer she saved, her divine essence grew. In the current battle, the enemy's strength and abilities grew as the battle progressed. It soon became clear that the clergymen were unable to cope and were significantly inferior to the monsters in strength and power, to the point that one of the goblins simply crushed a warrior like a bug in his fist. The priestess continued to transfer energy to her subordinates, but she felt that the monsters were deliberately doing everything they could to exhaust her. The thick-headed clergymen began to suspect that they were unlikely to win, and that things were turning out extremely unfavorably. Meanwhile, the enemy of God was transferring more and more power to her subordinates. She no longer held back and spewed energy in support of the monsters, intensifying the fear and doubt among the church warriors. The priestess tried her best, but soon realized that without a sacrifice, they would not be able to win. The girl prepared herself and, gathering all her strength, announced that this place would become her altar. The priestess wanted to use the magic of atonement to clear a path to the statue of the goddess, and then she would give all her strength down to the last drop. The priestess's determination was very strong, and she instilled hope in her subordinates. The clergy rushed into battle to show the enemies of God the power of their faith. They clashed with the monsters and were unable to do practically anything. The churchmen were torn to pieces by monstrous beasts and creatures whose strength only increased, and the taste of blood whetted their appetite even more. This led to some of the church warriors screaming that they did not want to die, rushing out of the temple, leaving their priestess alone with evil. The church warriors did not want to return to battle because they understood that no gods could save them from death. However, the temple doors were locked and would not let the traitors out. The priestess Naomi looked at her subordinates and sincerely did not understand why these people had so easily turned away from God. After all, she was ready to sacrifice her life, even though she was also too young and did not want to die in vain. At the foot of the temple at that moment, Yukito realized that he could not delay any longer and had to join the battle inside the temple. The young man did not know any tricks, did not know how to manipulate or persuade, so he decided to use honesty to negotiate with the adventurous players. Yukita Takahashi approached the players, saying that they had essentially fulfilled the request and would receive payment after leaving the dungeon. However, the young man asked the players to help him clear the temple. The young man did not have time to return to the guild and create a new request for clearing, so he asked them to treat this request as a personal one. The players trusted Yukita because he had been chosen by the hero, and he would not deceive them. However, they did not understand why they needed to help the clergy. Yukita decided to use the hero's authority and said that he had sent them to help the clergy for a reason. Surely the hero knew what he was doing. Besides, the young man himself did not want to leave the poor, naive child, the priestess Naomi, alone in trouble among wicked people. And now Yukita asked the players to help and support him, thereby expressing their respect for the hero. Different reasons worked for different people. Some were convinced by the authority of the clergy, while others took pity on the priestess Naomi, who was left in trouble. Thus, a group of adventurous players approached the temple to take part in the sacred battle. Takahashi approached the huge temple doors, happy that all the players had followed him, even though the hero's popularity played a big role in this. Before the young man could open the door, evil energy began to seep through the cracks and influence the players. After scanning the interior of the temple with a locator, the adventurers realized that things were bad, and that their opponent was indeed very strong. Even with the door closed, a murderous aura could be felt inside the room. Some of the players decided that no amount of money was worth such risks, and left the battlefield. However, even after half of the group left, Takahashi did not remain alone, and hoped that he and the remaining players would be able to defeat evil. Yukita did not condemn anyone, because he understood that he himself had descended into this dungeon, and was ready to participate in the battle only because he feared for his sister. The young man was not sure that he would have entered the temple if it weren't for the hero's manipulation. The young man's sad thoughts were interrupted by one of the players, who said that in such terrible moments of life, it is very important to smile and create a mood for victory. Inside, churchgoers continued to knock on the temple doors, dreaming of escaping imminent death. The door opened, and Takahashi's boot landed squarely on the head of one of the warriors. The adventurers entered the temple and declared that the wicked had come to the rescue, because they saw that the clergymen with high karma were in trouble. One of the church warriors shouted that people with evil souls should not go any further. The evil deity would become even stronger, and then no one would ever be able to defeat it. But the adventurous heroes said that people deserve a second chance and can be reborn by purifying their karma with good thoughts and deeds. Yukita assessed the enemy and realized that the main enemy was the statue towering above the altar, radiating evil and negative energy. Before going into battle, Yukita told the clergymen to shut their filthy mouths and not be such hypocrites, calling themselves spiritual people. If God blesses only those who live without sin, he said, then why did Christ make a sinner an apostle? And why did the sermon say that it was sinners who would be saved? These words were a revelation to everyone, including the priestess. The former sinners, the adventurous gamblers, were ready to show what they were capable of and prove that a person can start over at any moment in their life. The true strength of the adventurers who moved forward lay in the fact that they made mistakes again and again, but did not stop or stray from their path. Everyone was impressed by their words. Even the priestess Naomi took notice. But at that moment, one of the monstrous wolves lunged at the girl. Takahashi was faster, and using the silver slime's sword, destroyed the monster, ordering everyone to leave the conversation for later and focus on survival. A battle ensued between the monsters and the players, and all available means were used in the course of this battle. During the battle, the priestess Naomi replenished her strength by drinking an additional potion from a flask. After that, her abilities increased, but she felt that the monsters were much stronger than the beast on the 40th floor, and could not be defeated with items alone. Yukita realized that he had to fight the monsters face to face and took a stance, preparing for battle. Priestess Naomi announced the strengthening of all participants in the battle with newfound strength. Powerful energy filled the adventurers, and they began to look at their opponents more calmly, realizing that they were capable of defeating them. The players rushed to attack the goblins, believing in their strength and victory. One of the players blinded a huge goblin by piercing its eyes with a sword, thereby neutralizing a large and powerful opponent. The other players also used their abilities to the maximum, and Yukita noted that Naomi was doing an excellent job of providing support. If everything had gone according to the hero's plan from the start, the temple would already have been cleared. But now there were half as many players left, so it was more difficult for them to break through. There were still too many monsters, and the young man asked the priestess if she had any ideas on how to defeat them. The girl confirmed that there was such a method, and said that she would use atonement against the statue. The essence of atonement was that it was the only combat spell of the Holy Maiden class. It converted life force into magical energy, and simply wiped the enemy off the face of the earth. But this destruction came at the cost of life. However, the priestess Naomi had always been ready to give her life for the victory over evil, and now she was confident in the correctness of this decision. The girl stood in the face of her own death, planning to give her life for the people, and Yukita understood the full scale and importance of this act. The young man turned to the players and said that if they continued to fight the monsters one by one, they would not be able to win the battle. They needed to clear a path for the Holy Maiden to the statue. The players surrounded the priestess Naomi in a circle, and, receiving a new portion of magical support and enhancement of their abilities from her, began to slowly advance forward. In response, the enemy of God also intensified its attacks. Her evil energy poured out of her open mouth in a virtually continuous stream, and the players had to overcome very strong resistance. And behind the vanguard of players walked a little girl with a huge and pure soul, ready to give her life for all people. The procession was brought up the rear by a group of church warriors who hid behind the adventurers, rather than participating in the battle. Gradually, destroying all the monsters, goblins, and other creatures they encountered, the players grew more confident in their victory with each step, and soon the entire floor of the temple was littered with the bodies of slain creatures. Soon, the statue of God's enemy was defenseless, and before it stood the priestess Naomi, not hiding or taking cover behind anyone. The girl thanked the adventurous players and said that she would go on alone. After that, she began to pray. She was Indra's arrow and the Lord's thunder, ready to give up her flesh to become the salt of the earth. But in return, the enemy of God was destroyed. The girl managed to finish her prayer before she felt strong vibrations. Standing in that place, she could barely hold onto her staff with her small, bloodied child's hands. A moment later, her lifeless body lay on the floor of God's temple, having failed to defeat her enemy. But that was in a past life. Now, a tremor spread through the girl's body, and she did not understand what was happening. The young man had simply grown tired of listening to her prayers and decided to deal with all these divine matters himself. He jumped in front of the priestess and began striking God's enemy with his sword. When he was done, Takahashi asked the priestess if she had felt fear for her life when she looked death in the face. In response to this question, the girl burst into tears because she was ashamed of her reaction. After all, she had spent her whole life in church and was not afraid of death. But Yukita reassured her, saying that it was normal to fear death. Even Christ cried out in despair before his execution, afraid to part with life. This fact did not diminish him in the eyes of the priestess. The girl continued to cry, reasoning that as a saint she could only sacrifice her life to defeat the enemy of God, and was incapable of anything else. But Yukita said that she was still capable of much and should pray, for the Holy Virgin was obliged to offer prayers to God for salvation. All the years that the girl followed the scriptures and lived in the church, her faith was unshakable and her life righteous. But true prayer comes when you face injustice. It is in these moments that a person entrusts everything to God and prays for salvation. So the girl knelt down and began to pray. She clasped her hands together, crossed them at chest level, and began to think about the best. Until that moment, the priestess Naomi did not know what true prayer was. But it was good that this realization finally came to her. Under the influence of the prayers read by the priestess, God's enemy began to weaken. His insides shrank, and the streams of aggressive energy ceased. The girl continued to pray, and soon heard a voice from above saying that she should ask, and it would be given to her. The priestess's prayers were useful not only for defeating God's enemy, they were also necessary for changing professions. In addition to the priestess's prayers, a consecrated altar was needed, which, fortunately, was available. Under normal circumstances, an adventurer would not be able to change professions in the heat of battle, especially when the holy altar is under enemy control. But Takahashi Yukita was an exception to the rule, and was able to activate the profession change. An analysis of the altar was conducted, confirming that it was under human control. After that, the game provided a list of possible professions to which he could change his own. The priestess was surprised that the profession change was activated in a captured temple, but it was made possible by her prayers. Naomi was sure that the young man would change his profession from adventurer to paladin, a servant of the church, in order to stay with the priestess and possess healing magic and the highest protection. In addition, many in the temple boasted a similar profession, and Yukita would have pleasant friends and colleagues. However, the young man was not eager to be tied to the gods and immediately rejected this prospect. His choice surprised many. Soon, the career change was activated, and Takahashi stood waiting for his system to be completely rebooted under the golden light of the program. The young man chose the most suitable profession for himself and became a jester. Naomi sincerely did not understand why, of all the available options, he chose the worst one. Even in his past life, no one had ever chosen this profession. It was among the least popular because all the skills of a jester were based on probability and luck. People who chose this profession did not understand its essence and often lost. But now, for Yukita, a profession whose power depended on luck was precisely his main ability and innate talent. Of course, the young man could use some reinforcement, and when the priestess Naomi heard this, she immediately rushed for her staff to thank her savior in some way. The enhancement was supposed to give a bonus to attack power, and the title Sacred Assassin was supposed to increase damage to undead creatures. In addition, activating Crushing Blow increased critical damage, which could be very useful in future battles. Finally, the jester possessed the skill Dazzling Flash. This effect dealt 10 times the damage and lasted for an hour. Thus, with all these enhancements, Takahashi launched his final attack on the Lord's enemy. Of course, the enemy still tried to resist, sending evil and negative energy in the direction of the young man, but it was already impossible to stop the young man. The last thing God's enemy saw was a player named Yukita Takahashi with a sword in his hand. A crushing blow split the statue, and it shattered into small pieces. History remembered slaves who became kings, as well as jesters who challenged the gods themselves. The fall and destruction of God's main enemy became a universal celebration for all participants in the battle. All that remained for the players was to finish off the remaining monsters and beasts, which no longer posed any danger, as they were no longer fueled by negative energy. The players congratulated each other on the end of the battle, and noted that, fortunately, there were no casualties. And the priestess Naomi, her eyes full of surprise and insight, watched what was happening. Light streamed through the temple windows into the church, illuminating everyone with its warmth and confidence in a better future. The player Yukita defeated Baal's doppelganger and received notification of this, after which he became the slayer of the dark gods. The temple came under the complete control of the people, and soon the doors of the church swung open, and the people felt relief at the realization that the temple was free. Outside, the players were met by adventurers who had not taken part in the battle. All this time, they had not left and waited for the players, as well as trying to cover their backs, because they could not help in the battle. The players requested reinforcements from the Adventurers Guild, but it turned out that there was no need. In addition, they detained several suspicious individuals who were trying to escape. They turned out to be clergymen who had cowardly fled in the face of the enemy and betrayed their church. According to church rules, it judges its own people, so the priestess accepted her former subordinates. She thanked the adventurer players for capturing the fugitives and apologized for the inconvenience. Priestess Naomi intended to impose an appropriate punishment on the cowardly clergymen. The main issues had been settled, and now everything could be entrusted to the guild, and they could go home. In addition, Takahashi was going to the guild headquarters to report on certain circumstances. At the last moment, Naomi asked the young man to answer one question. The young man said that he was not particularly religious, but he was well versed in sacred texts, and Naomi wanted to know where he had learned this. Yukita began to quickly think of a suitable answer because he didn't want to tell the truth. This old skill remained with him from his past life, when he helped distribute food to religious people. One of the nuns saw the young man studying sacred texts, and it worked. The young man immediately received an extra portion of food, but of course, he couldn't say anything about it out loud. Returning to the city, the priestess Naomi had to pass judgment on the clergy who had fled the battlefield and betrayed their faith. The guilty warriors begged their mistress for mercy on their knees, telling her how sorry they were for their sins. but now they understood everything and asked for mercy. The priestess Naomi was a very kind girl and promised that God would give them a chance. However, she did not specify that this chance would only come after the traitors had served their time in prison, because according to the laws of the world, they would be punished for their sins against the people. When the current affairs were settled, Naomi took off her cap and went to receive her punishment. The warriors of the church rushed to convince their leader that she was still too young and not guilty of anything, and that it was their fault for failing to eradicate the evil around their priestess. Naomi declared that age was irrelevant before God, and that she could no longer hold this position. The girl confessed that she was guilty of indifference and laziness. Therefore, Naomi decided to give up her position as abbess and start from scratch, as a student. But first of all, she needed to learn more about the world, through her own life experience, not from stories and books. After all, she had indeed fallen behind God's enemy, because he had studied people. Even an adventurous gambler had managed to achieve excellent results. This meant that Naomi needed to learn everything this kind young man could teach her. Yukita Takahashi sat alone at the table in the living room, resting after the battle and listening to the news report about the victory over God's enemy. The doorbell rang, and at the threshold of his apartment, the young man saw a little girl with a church book in her hands. The protagonist did not particularly want to continue their conversation, and immediately stated that he was fine with religion. But it was not easy to get rid of the girl. She used magic, because without an attacking effect, it was allowed to be used on the surface. The guy realized that he couldn't get rid of this persistent girl quickly, and when he was about to send her away on some important business, the apartment door flew open. The young man's mother came out into the hallway and asked what was going on, because it seemed that they had guests. Naomi immediately introduced herself as Yukito's younger friend, and said that her name was Naomi Nameless. The woman looked closely at the girl's face, because she felt like she had seen this little girl somewhere before. This turned out to be true, because the girl worked as a volunteer at a food bank, and distributed food together with church representatives to the poor. The woman remembered that despite her age, the girl was in charge, even though she was surrounded by adults. Naomi confirmed that volunteering was part of her department's daily routine, and Yukito became convinced that church members really did help people. Naomi admitted that Mr. Hiro had given her the young man's address. Sitting over tea and refreshments, the girl told her mother that she wanted to throw a party with Yukito. After all, her mother's illness had passed, and it was a great occasion to celebrate. Besides, the young man was doing very well in his studies, and now he could afford it. There was no need to ensure a constant, guaranteed rare drop. She could just relax and unwind a little. And Naomi, munching on cookies with her tea, told her mother that she saw the light of the world in Yukito. It sounded too pompous, solemn, and serious. And the boy immediately realized that she was making it up just to avoid telling the truth. But at the same time, Takahashi understood that sooner or later he would come across a dungeon that he would not be able to clear on his own, because the guild manager had repeatedly advised him not to go alone. In this case, Naomi could be useful to him, because a skilled buffer is worth their weight in gold, and such people are usually immediately taken by top-level teams. So Takahashi decided it was worth trying to work with this girl, and held out his hand to seal the deal with a handshake. But before setting off on new dungeon raids with Naomi, the young man made some preparations and, first of all, bought a new house. Because the guy had become famous, he needed to worry about his safety, as well as the safety of his family and loved ones. In addition, Naomi had left the church, and everyone was now interested in where the girl would live. She needed to be provided with housing. And in the worst-case scenario, if something happened to Yukito himself, his family and loved ones would have a place to live. The player began to think about a safety net, and received monetary compensation from the guild for his services. He wrote a will, and prepared everything to leave his family a decent fortune. Only then was the guy finally ready to embark on an adventure. Not for someone else, but for himself. He needed this, and his partner, who was happily dressed up, looked like a real girlfriend. Having finished all the preparations, Yukito and Naomi set off into a new, unknown life full of adventure and excitement. The young man believed that even if he acquired partners, the situation around him would not change. Soon, Takahashi reached level 70 in record time. Of course, he was still far from Mr. Hiro, but the Golden League had already accepted him into its ranks. It was still impossible to catch up with Mr. Hiro, because he grew faster than Yukito, having more serious abilities from the start. However, this did not bother the young man. In any case, he would continue doing what he was doing, especially since now he had the perfect companion. Takahashi did not forget his past life and the mistakes he had made back then, because he had no hope. He was used to being weaker than others, but now, with so many opportunities open to him, The whole world seemed close and accessible. Stepping out onto the lawn in one of the dungeons, he met his old acquaintances, the Silver Slimes. Naomi offered to give him a speed boost, but Yukito refused because he wanted to fight the Silver Slimes one-on-one. Soon, the trio of monsters was rushing towards the player, but luck was again on the young man's side, and he managed to turn the odds in his favor. The boy's movements were relaxed and confident, and soon there was nothing left of the Silver Slimes. And once again, rare items were offered to him as a reward for his work. The young man decided to take care of the rare resources next time and make something more useful out of them. But his thoughts were interrupted by an old acquaintance. It was a player whom the young man had once encountered in the early stages of his gaming career. The man thanked Yukito for the equipment, which still served him faithfully. However, it turned out that the player was no longer involved in clearing, because he had retrained as a blacksmith. As a fighter, he had reached his ceiling, and being just an adventurer with no prospects had become uninteresting. The blacksmith invited the young man to visit his shop, where he could buy or repair armor, which was very nice. The man promised to give him the best service, because, after all, Takahashi Yukito was his savior. It was nice to hear that his help had given someone a reason to start a new life, and the young man realized that he had not opened the retraining temple in vain. The wonderful little temple was located in one of the beautiful mountain valleys. Inside the temple, the players were greeted by a nun. Yukito and Naomi stood in the center of the temple, and the girl activated a magical teleportation device that took them deep into the underground. In this way, they traveled to the desired location and met their partners there. It was a group of adventurous warriors, with whom Takahashi had managed to defeat God's enemy and save Naomi's life. The players greeted their leader and said they hoped to learn a lot from him, as he had managed to defeat many rare enemies, and it was impossible to do so by luck alone. The group set off on a mission across sandy terrain, which was covered with stone outcrops in places. The boss monster of this dungeon turned out to be a huge scorpion with a giant poisonous sting on its tail. The monster was poisonous, so it was necessary to remain alert and cautious. The players went on the attack, using their abilities. Yukito Takahashi was sure that even if luck was just a randomly acquired ability, everything else the guy had achieved was thanks to his own actions, and that was where his strength lay. The scorpion lay dead, its limbs severed. The players rested in a clearing after completing the cleanup, receiving water and healing potions from Naomi. Yukito believed that one cannot be a sociophobe forever. It was time to actively communicate with other people, not just with his family. And he did this during dungeon clearings as well. Another monster, a dragon, decided to pay the team a visit in the hope of finding someone to devour. The young man ordered Naomi to be ready because they would soon have to move on. They had work to do. The girl enthusiastically prepared to buff her friend and partner and, clutching her staff in her hands, activated her magical power. Jumping high into the sky and receiving additional energy from his partner, Yukito struck the monster. The dragon was cut in half, and Yukito Takahashi became even stronger, thanks to his luck.